We first make our habits, and then our habits make us. Friends, pause for a moment and let that sink in, because inside that simple sentence lies one of the most powerful truths about human life. Every morning you wake up, every reaction you have, every thought that runs quietly through your mind, much of it is not new. It is familiar, automatic, repeated, and over time, those repetitions slowly shape the person you believe you are. Welcome, friends, to the audiobook experience of breaking the habit of being yourself, how to lose your mind and create a new one. I'm glad you're here with me, because what you are about to explore is not just another self-help idea. It is a journey into the hidden architecture of your mind, into the invisible patterns of thoughts, emotions, and habits that quietly design your life. For most of us, life feels predictable. We wake up with the same thoughts, react with the same emotions, and move through the same routines. And without realizing it, we begin to live in a loop. Yesterday becomes today, and today becomes tomorrow. But here's the deeper question, friends. What if the person you think you are is simply a collection of habits? Habits of thinking, habits of feeling, habits of reacting. And what if those habits are wired directly into the neural circuits of your brain? Modern neuroscience is revealing something extraordinary. Your brain is not fixed. It is constantly changing, adapting, rewiring itself. Scientists call this neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to reorganize its connections based on what you repeatedly think, feel, and experience. That means the life you experience today is not just the result of circumstances. It is also the result of the thoughts and emotions you have practiced so many times that your brain has memorized them. And when a thought is practiced enough, it becomes a belief. When a belief is repeated enough, it becomes a behavior. And when a behavior is repeated enough, it becomes your personality. Friends, here is the quiet but powerful truth that many people overlook. Your personality creates your personal reality. So if you keep thinking the same thoughts, feeling the same emotions, and reacting in the same ways, your life will continue to produce the same results. That realization can feel uncomfortable at first, but it is also incredibly empowering. Because if your brain can learn those patterns, it can also unlearn them. In fact, I have seen countless examples of people who changed their lives by first changing their minds. Some recovered from illnesses doctors considered permanent. Others transformed careers, relationships, and personal limitations that once seemed impossible to overcome. At first glance, these transformations appear mysterious. People often call them spontaneous miracles. But when you look deeper, something fascinating begins to emerge. Behind many of these changes is a shift in consciousness, a deliberate change in how a person thinks, feels, and perceives themselves. In other words, they stop being the same person they had always been. Friends, think about that for a moment. If your thoughts shape the neural wiring of your brain, and your emotions condition your body to feel a certain way, then most of who you are today may simply be a memorized state of being. Your body has learned to feel the emotions of your past so well that it begins to expect them. Stress, frustration, worry, anger. The body becomes chemically addicted to those familiar emotional states. And without realizing it, we start living from the past instead of creating the future. We remember painful experiences. We replay old conversations. We anticipate problems before they even happen. And each time we do this, we fire the same neural circuits in the brain, strengthening the same identity again and again. But here is where the story begins to shift. Because once you become aware of this pattern, you step into a completely different role. You move from being the actor in your life to becoming the observer of your life. And that shift, from unconscious habit to conscious awareness, is where real transformation begins. Friends, awareness is the doorway to freedom. When you begin to notice your thoughts instead of automatically believing them, when you observe your emotional reactions instead of instantly acting on them, You create a small but powerful space between stimulus and response. In that space, the old self begins to loosen its grip, and something new becomes possible. You begin to realize that the thoughts running through your mind are not necessarily the truth. They are simply mental programs built from past experiences. And if they were programmed, they can be reprogrammed. That is where meditation, mental rehearsal, and conscious intention enter the picture. When you intentionally focus your attention on new possibilities, when you combine clear thoughts with elevated emotions such as gratitude, inspiration, or love, you begin activating new neural pathways in the brain. Your brain literally starts building a new version of you. Friends, think of it like this. Your brain is constantly listening to what you repeatedly think and feel, and it faithfully wires itself to match those patterns. If you keep rehearsing the same worries, the same limitations, the same identity, your brain will continue strengthening the old version of you. But if you begin to rehearse a new future in your mind, imagining the person you want to become, feeling the emotions of that future before it arrives, your brain begins preparing your body for that reality. The remarkable thing is that the brain often cannot distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a real one, which means that when you mentally rehearse a new way of being, you are literally training your brain and body to become that person. This is where science meets something that ancient spiritual traditions have always suggested. Your inner world influences your outer world. Your thoughts influence your biology. Your emotions influence your energy. And together, they shape the life you experience. Now, friends, before we move deeper into this journey, I want to pause for a moment. If you're enjoying this audiobook experience, take a second to like and press the subscribe button so that this message can reach more people who may truly need it. Sometimes the right idea, at the right moment, can change the direction of someone's entire life. And who knows, perhaps someone out there is waiting for this very conversation. Now let's continue. Because once you begin to understand that your brain, your emotions, and your habits are shaping your reality, an exciting question naturally appears. If your current identity was built through repetition, could you intentionally build a new one? Could you train your mind to think differently, feel differently, and ultimately live differently? Friends, the rest of this journey is about discovering that answer. And as we move forward together, you may start noticing something fascinating happening inside you. Ideas that once felt impossible may begin to feel believable. Patterns that once felt permanent may begin to loosen. And the person you thought you had to be might slowly start dissolving. Because the greatest habit you will ever break is the habit of being the same version of yourself. And once that habit begins to break, a completely new life can begin. Reality is not something you simply observe. It is something you participate in creating. Friends, pause with that thought for a moment. Because the deeper we look into the nature of our world, the more we begin to realize that the life we experience may not be as fixed, solid, or predetermined as we once believed. For centuries, people assumed that the universe was like a giant machine, a perfectly predictable system made of solid matter moving according to rigid laws, where every event had already been set in motion long before we arrived, and where human beings were little more than passengers riding inside a world they could barely influence. That belief quietly shaped how we saw ourselves. It whispered that circumstances control outcomes, that environments define possibilities, that we are mostly reacting to reality rather than shaping it. But something extraordinary began to happen when scientists started exploring the deepest levels of matter. When physicists looked beyond the surface of what appears solid and discovered a world so strange, so fluid, so mysterious, that it completely reshaped how we understand reality. What they found was not a universe made of rigid objects, but a universe made of energy, vibrating fields, possibilities waiting to take form. At the smallest level of existence, the level of atoms and subatomic particles, matter behaves less like solid substance and more like a wave of potential. This discovery gave birth to a new understanding of the world, a field of study known as quantum physics. And with it came a radical realization that forever changed the relationship between mind and matter. The moment scientists began observing subatomic particles, something fascinating happened. These particles did not behave in fixed, predictable ways when they were not being observed. Instead, they existed in a field of probabilities, a kind of invisible ocean of potential outcomes. Yet the moment a scientist focused attention on a particle, the wave of possibilities collapsed into a single physical event. In other words, the act of observation influenced the outcome. Friends, this discovery is called the observer effect, and it quietly suggests something astonishing. Your attention has an influence on the physical world. This means that reality may not be something that simply happens to you. Reality may be something you participate in creating through your focus, your thoughts, and your awareness. Take a moment to imagine that. Imagine that beneath the solid appearance of your life lies a vast, invisible field of possibilities, a quantum field containing every potential version of your future. A version where you are healthier, a version where you are more confident, a version where you have transformed the habits that once held you back. Every one of those possibilities exists as energy, waiting for a conscious observer to give it direction. This is why understanding the quantum nature of reality becomes deeply personal. Because if everything in the physical universe is ultimately made of energy, and your thoughts are also forms of energy, then the boundary between mind and matter begins to dissolve. Friends, you are not just a physical body moving through a solid world. You are a conscious being interacting with a field of infinite possibilities. For centuries, the separation between mind and matter shaped how people understood life. Philosophers believed that matter belonged to science while thoughts belonged to philosophy or religion, as if the two worlds were entirely separate. But modern discoveries revealed that this separation was incomplete. Matter and energy are interchangeable, and consciousness itself appears to influence how energy organizes into physical form. Suddenly, the question becomes deeply personal. If attention can influence particles at the quantum level, could focused thought influence events in your life? Consider the implications. Every experience you have ever had, every emotion you have felt, every belief you carry has shaped the neural circuits inside your brain. Your brain is not static. It is constantly reorganizing itself according to what you repeatedly think and feel. This remarkable ability is known as neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself through experience. Every time you think a familiar thought, certain neurons fire together. Over time, those neurons form stronger connections, turning thoughts into habits and habits into automatic patterns of perception. Eventually, these patterns become your personality. Personality is simply the collection of how you think, how you act, and how you feel on a consistent basis. Yet personality creates personal reality. That means if you keep thinking the same thoughts every day, feeling the same emotions, and reacting to life in the same ways, your brain continues reinforcing the same identity, and that identity continues producing the same life. Friends, many people try to change their lives without realizing that their brains have been conditioned to think in predictable patterns. They attempt to create new outcomes while maintaining the same mindset that created the old ones. The environment remains the same, the emotional reactions remain the same, and the familiar identity quietly recreates the same experiences again and again. Breaking this cycle requires something deeper than simply wishing for change. It requires becoming aware of the observer within you. Awareness is where transformation begins. When you step back and observe your thoughts instead of automatically believing them, you create a moment of separation between the old identity and the conscious self that is capable of change. This shift may feel subtle at first, but it opens the door to something extraordinary. Once you become aware of your habitual thoughts and emotions, you begin to recognize that they are not permanent truths. They are simply neural patterns built from past experiences. The past leaves emotional imprints in the brain and body. A painful memory can trigger the same emotional chemistry years later, causing the body to relive an experience that no longer exists in the present moment. Over time, the body becomes conditioned to expect those familiar emotional states. Stress, frustration, anxiety, resentment. The body learns to memorize them. Eventually, the body becomes so accustomed to those emotional patterns that it begins signaling the brain to reproduce the thoughts that match them. This creates a feedback loop between mind and body, where thoughts trigger emotions and emotions reinforce the same thoughts. In this state, the past begins to control the present. Yet something powerful happens when you become aware of this pattern. Awareness interrupts the automatic cycle. Instead of reacting unconsciously, you begin to observe the emotions rising within you. Observation creates space. In that space, you gain the freedom to respond differently. This is where meditation becomes such a transformative tool. Meditation is not simply about relaxation or escaping from the world. Meditation is the practice of becoming familiar with your own mind. It is the practice of stepping outside the habitual identity that has been conditioned by years of repeated thoughts and emotions. During meditation, the mind gradually quiets, the constant chatter slows down, and awareness begins to deepen. In that stillness, something remarkable happens. You become less identified with your environment, your body, and even the passing thoughts within your mind. For a brief moment, you experience yourself as pure awareness. In that state, you are no longer defined by the memories of the past or the expectations of the future. You are simply present. Presence reconnects you with the quantum field of possibilities. Friends, the present moment is where creation begins. The past contains memories, the future contains potential, but the present moment is where consciousness interacts with reality. When you bring your full attention into the present moment, your brain shifts into new patterns of activity. Old neural circuits begin to weaken, and new ones begin forming. The brain becomes flexible again, capable of imagining and rehearsing new ways of being. Mental rehearsal is one of the most powerful ways to reshape the brain. When you vividly imagine a future experience, the brain often activates the same neural networks that would fire during the actual event. This means that by rehearsing a new way of thinking, feeling, and behaving, you begin installing that future identity into the brain. Athletes have used this technique for decades. Musicians use it when practicing difficult performances. The brain learns through repetition, whether the experience is physical or vividly imagined. Friends, imagine rehearsing the version of yourself that you want to become. Imagine responding to challenges with calm instead of frustration. Imagine speaking with confidence instead of hesitation. Imagine feeling gratitude instead of worry. Every time you mentally rehearse those states, your brain begins wiring itself for that new identity. But thoughts alone are not enough. Emotion is the energy that signals the body that something is real. When you combine clear intention with elevated emotions such as gratitude, love, or inspiration, you create a powerful state of being. In that moment, your mind and body become aligned. Your thoughts provide direction, and your emotions provide energy. This coherent state influences the way your brain functions, the way your body feels, and the way your attention interacts with the world around you. Friends, this is where transformation becomes more than an idea. You are no longer waiting for life to change before you feel better. You begin generating the emotional state of the future before it arrives. When the body begins experiencing the chemistry of that future in the present moment, your brain starts believing that the new reality is already unfolding. Over time, the familiar identity built from past memories begins dissolving. A new identity emerges, one shaped not by old experiences, but by conscious intention. The observer within you becomes stronger than the habits of the past. Life begins to respond differently when your perception changes. Opportunities that once seemed invisible begin appearing. Conversations feel different. Decisions feel clearer. The world itself appears to shift because your awareness is interacting with reality in a new way. Friends, this is the deeper message hidden within the quantum nature of the universe. You are not a passive observer drifting through life. You are a conscious participant in the unfolding of reality. Every thought carries energy. Every emotion sends signals through your nervous system. Every moment of awareness influences the direction of your life. The quantum field holds infinite possibilities, yet only one becomes your experience at any given moment. The question quietly becomes personal. Where will you place your attention? Will it remain fixed on the familiar patterns of the past, replaying old stories and reinforcing the identity that created them? Or will you begin focusing on a new possibility, a new version of yourself that exists as potential within the field of reality? Friends, the power to change begins with that choice. The moment you become aware of your thoughts, you step beyond the automatic identity that once defined you. The moment you intentionally imagine a different future, your brain begins constructing it. The moment you feel the emotions of that future in the present, your body starts aligning with it. Reality responds not just to what you do, but to who you are being. This realization invites a new kind of responsibility, yet it also opens a door to extraordinary freedom. Because if the observer influences reality, then learning to direct your attention with clarity, intention, and elevated emotion becomes one of the most powerful skills you can develop. Friends, every day offers countless moments where awareness can replace habit, where possibility can replace limitation, where a new identity can begin quietly forming within your mind. And somewhere within that vast quantum field of potential, the future version of you already exists, waiting patiently for your attention to bring it into reality. Your environment is not just where you live, it is where your identity quietly learns to repeat itself. Friends, think about that for a moment, because most people never realize how deeply their surroundings shape their thoughts, their emotions, and ultimately the person they become. Every room you walk into, every conversation you have, every routine you follow, every familiar street you drive down, all of it acts like a silent reminder of who you have been. Without noticing it, the environment constantly whispers the same message to your brain. Remember who you are. Remember how you feel. Remember how you react. This is where the real challenge of transformation begins. The moment you decide you want to change your life, something interesting happens. The outer world, the same people, the same places, the same routines, begins pulling you back toward the person you used to be. Not because the world is against you, but because your brain has been conditioned to respond automatically to the familiar signals in your environment. Friends, the brain is an extraordinary recording device. Every experience you have ever lived, every relationship you have formed, every place you have visited, every habit you have repeated has been stored in the intricate networks of neurons inside your mind. Your brain literally reflects the life you have lived. The people you know, the things you own, the places you frequent. All of these experiences are wired into your neural circuits. This means something powerful. Most of the time, when you interact with your environment, it automatically activates those existing circuits. The same neurons fire, the same memories appear, the same emotions return, and before you realize it, you are thinking the same thoughts you thought yesterday. Reality begins repeating itself. Imagine waking up in the same bedroom, seeing the same walls, the same objects, the same phone notifications, the same familiar routines. Each one acts like a trigger that reminds your brain of who you have been. Your mind begins replaying the same mental programs, and those programs generate the same emotions you have felt for years. This is why change often feels so difficult. Friends, when the environment controls how you think and feel, you end up thinking equal to your circumstances. Your outer world becomes the blueprint of your inner world. And if the same thoughts keep firing every day, the same reality keeps appearing in your life again and again. This is the invisible cycle most people live inside. They wake up thinking about their problems, they replay the same worries during the day, they react emotionally to the same frustrations, and then they fall asleep only to repeat the same pattern tomorrow. Life becomes predictable, but transformation begins the moment you realize something revolutionary. To create a new future, you must become greater than your environment. Friends, this idea may sound simple, but it is one of the most powerful principles of personal change. If the external world constantly reminds you of the person you used to be, then the only way to become someone new is to stop allowing the environment to define your state of mind. In other words, your thoughts must become stronger than the signals coming from the world around you. This is where the power of conscious awareness begins to shine. When you become aware of how your environment influences your thoughts, you begin to interrupt the automatic reactions that once controlled you. Instead of responding unconsciously to every familiar trigger, you pause. You observe. You notice the thought forming in your mind before it takes over. This small moment of awareness creates space. And inside that space, something remarkable becomes possible. You can choose a different thought. Friends, this is the beginning of freedom. Because the moment you begin thinking independently of your environment, your brain starts forming new neural connections. The old circuits that once defined your identity begin weakening, while new circuits start forming in response to your new thoughts. This is neuroplasticity in action, the brain's ability to reorganize itself according to what you repeatedly think and experience. Yet something even deeper is happening inside you. Your identity is beginning to change. Most people believe that who they are is fixed, that personality is something permanent, something determined by genetics or circumstances. But neuroscience suggests something very different. Personality is simply a collection of habits. Habits of thinking, habits of feeling, habits of behaving. And if those habits were learned, they can also be unlearned. Friends, think about the last time you reacted emotionally to a familiar situation. Maybe someone criticized you, maybe a stressful problem appeared, maybe a memory from the past resurfaced. Without even thinking about it, your body reacted with the same emotional chemistry it has produced many times before. Anger, fear, frustration, anxiety. These emotions are not just psychological experiences. They are chemical signals that travel through your body, reinforcing the same patterns of thinking that created them. Over time, the body begins memorizing those emotional states. In fact, the body can become so familiar with those emotions that it begins craving them. Your thoughts trigger the emotion reinforces the thought, and a powerful loop forms between mind and body. Soon the body begins running the mind. Friends, this is why many people remain trapped in the same emotional states for years. Even when they want to move forward, their body keeps pulling them back toward the familiar feelings of the past. The environment then plays its role again. A place reminds you of an old experience. A person triggers a familiar reaction. A memory activates the same emotional chemistry. Suddenly the past feels alive again. This is how the environment keeps reinforcing your identity. Every external cue becomes a reminder of who you have been. And if your thoughts keep returning to the past, your future will begin to look exactly like your past. But there is another possibility waiting quietly within your mind: the ability to think beyond your environment. Friends, human beings possess a remarkable gift: the ability to imagine experiences that have not yet happened. This ability comes from the most advanced part of the brain, the frontal lobe, the creative center responsible for intention, awareness, and conscious choice. When you use this part of your brain deliberately, something extraordinary happens. Your mind can begin creating a future before it physically exists. This is where mental rehearsal enters the story. Research has shown that when people vividly imagine performing an action, The brain activates the same neural circuits that would fire if they were actually performing the action in real life. In other words, the brain begins preparing for the experience even though it has not happened yet. Friends, imagine what this means for your life. If you repeatedly rehearse a new way of thinking, acting, and feeling, your brain begins wiring itself for that future reality. The neural circuits necessary for that experience begin forming inside your mind before the event ever occurs. Your brain begins living in the future ahead of your environment. This is one of the most powerful tools for overcoming the influence of your surroundings. Instead of allowing the environment to dictate your thoughts, you intentionally direct your attention toward the person you want to become. You imagine how that version of you thinks. You imagine how that version of you speaks. You imagine how that version of you responds to challenges. Over time, those mental rehearsals build new neural networks. And eventually, those networks become your new habits. Friends, the moment your internal world becomes stronger than your external environment, your life begins to change. Because when your thoughts are no longer controlled by circumstances, you begin responding to life from a new level of consciousness. The old identity starts dissolving. A new identity begins forming. This shift is not always comfortable. The body may resist. Old emotions may appear. Familiar thoughts may try to pull you back into the past. Yet every time you choose a new thought, every time you maintain awareness instead of reacting automatically, you weaken the old neural patterns that once controlled you. Gradually, the environment loses its power. The world outside you stops dictating who you are. Friends, this is the moment when something truly beautiful begins to happen. You start living from intention instead of reaction. Your thoughts begin shaping your environment rather than the environment shaping your thoughts. You stop repeating the past. You start creating the future. The people who changed history understood this principle deeply. Visionaries, inventors, leaders, and dreamers throughout time all had one thing in common. They held on to an idea of the future that was stronger than the reality surrounding them. They refused to let the present environment dictate their belief in what was possible. Inside their minds, the future already existed. Friends, that same power lives inside you. The environment may try to remind you of who you were yesterday. Your memories may attempt to replay the same emotions. Your habits may try to pull you back toward the familiar. Yet awareness gives you a different option. You can step outside those patterns. You can imagine a new version of yourself. You can rehearse that identity with intention, clarity, and elevated emotion. Slowly, quietly, the brain begins rewriting itself. Neural circuits reorganize. Old emotional attachments loosen. A new state of being begins forming within you. And one day, without even realizing when it happened, you look around at your life and notice something extraordinary. The environment that once defined you has started reflecting the person you have become. The body becomes the mind when emotions become habits. Friends, that sentence may sound simple at first, but hidden inside it is one of the most fascinating psychological discoveries about human behavior. Most people believe they are thinking their way through life, making decisions consciously, evaluating situations logically, choosing responses deliberately. Yet beneath the surface, something far more powerful is often running the show. The body remembers. Not just physical movements, not just skills like riding a bicycle or typing on a keyboard, but emotional experiences. Every time you react with frustration, every time you feel anxiety, every time anger rises or disappointment sinks into your chest, your brain releases a cocktail of chemicals that travel through the bloodstream and bathe every cell in your body. These chemicals carry emotional messages, and over time your body becomes familiar with them. What begins as a temporary emotional reaction slowly becomes a memorized state of being. Friends, think about how many times a person experiences stress in modern life. A traffic jam, a demanding boss, financial pressure, relationship tension, deadlines, constant notifications, worries about the future. Each event triggers the same biological response inside the body, a response designed originally to help humans survive immediate danger. The stress response. Deep within your brain sits an ancient survival system that prepares your body to face threats. When danger appears, your brain releases stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol, increasing heart rate, sharpening focus, tightening muscles, and preparing the body to fight or run. For our ancestors facing predators, this system was life-saving. But friends, the modern world rarely presents physical predators. Instead, the brain reacts to psychological threats, a critical comment, an uncertain future, a remembered argument, an imagined problem that has not even happened yet. The body reacts the same way it would if danger were physically present. Stress hormones flood the system, heart rate rises, breathing becomes shallow, muscles tense. And when this happens repeatedly, day after day, week after week, the body becomes chemically addicted to stress. This is where something extraordinary begins to occur. The body starts expecting those familiar chemicals. Cells develop receptor sites that respond to the emotional signals being released repeatedly. Over time, the body becomes conditioned to crave the same emotional states it has experienced most often. Friends, the body begins asking the mind to create the thoughts that will produce those emotions again. Suddenly, the relationship between mind and body changes. Instead of the mind controlling the body begins influencing the mind. A familiar emotion rises, and without realizing it, your mind searches for thoughts that justify that feeling. If your body is used to anxiety, the mind finds reasons to worry. If your body is used to anger, the mind finds reasons to criticize. If your body is used to sadness, the mind remembers painful moments from the past. This is emotional conditioning. And once this conditioning becomes strong enough, it forms the foundation of what we call the subconscious mind. Friends, the subconscious mind is simply a collection of automated programs built from repeated experiences. Habits of thought, habits of reaction, habits of feeling. These programs operate beneath conscious awareness, running quietly in the background of everyday life. Researchers suggest that a large portion of our daily actions, thoughts, and emotional reactions are governed by these subconscious patterns. This means that much of what you do today may actually be the result of programs written long ago, perhaps years ago, perhaps decades ago, perhaps during childhood. At some point, an experience created a strong emotional reaction. Your brain recorded the event, your body memorized the feeling, and over time the same emotional pattern repeated itself until it became automatic. Friends, when the body becomes the subconscious mind, it begins driving behavior without conscious thought. Imagine someone who has practiced frustration for many years. A small inconvenience appears, and immediately their body produces the chemical signature of irritation. The mind then searches for thoughts that match the feeling. This always happens to me. Nothing ever works out. People are so incompetent. Within seconds, the emotional pattern is complete. The person did not consciously choose it. The body simply ran the program. Now imagine someone who has practiced fear for years. A new opportunity appears, yet the body instantly releases chemicals associated with uncertainty. The mind responds by creating cautious thoughts. What if I fail? What if people judge me? What if it goes wrong? The body has already decided the emotional tone before the mind finishes thinking. Friends, this is how deeply the body can influence identity. The body becomes the past. Every emotional memory stored in the nervous system acts like an invisible chain tying you to previous experiences. Even when you consciously want to change your life, your body may resist because it has become comfortable with familiar emotional states. Comfort does not always mean happiness. Sometimes comfort simply means familiarity. Someone can become comfortable with stress, comfortable with disappointment, comfortable with self-doubt. The emotions may not feel good, but they feel known, predictable, recognizable. Breaking free from this cycle requires something extraordinary. It requires teaching the body a new emotional future. Friends, this is where meditation becomes a powerful bridge between neuroscience and transformation. Meditation allows you to sit quietly with your thoughts and observe the emotional signals arising in your body. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. The mind may wander. The body may feel restless. Old emotions may surface. Yet this is precisely the moment when awareness begins to reclaim control. Observation interrupts automatic patterns. Instead of reacting to the emotion, you watch it. Instead of identifying with the feeling, you notice it passing through the body. This subtle shift changes the relationship between consciousness and the subconscious program. The observer becomes stronger than the habit. Neuroscience has shown that when you repeatedly interrupt automatic reactions, the neural circuits responsible for those patterns begin weakening. The brain literally starts dismantling the old emotional pathways that once dominated your behavior. At the same time, something new can begin forming. Friends, when the mind becomes clear and focused during meditation, you gain access to the creative potential of the brain's frontal lobe. This region allows you to imagine new possibilities, new behaviors, new emotional states. You can begin rehearsing the person you want to become. Mental rehearsal is a fascinating phenomenon studied in neuroscience and psychology. When you vividly imagine performing an action or experiencing a certain emotion, the brain activates neural networks similar to those used during the actual experience. This means the brain begins practicing the future before it arrives. Imagine rehearsing calm confidence in a situation that once triggered anxiety. Imagine visualizing yourself responding with patience where frustration once appeared. Imagine feeling gratitude where stress once lived. Each time you mentally practice that new state of being, your brain begins wiring itself accordingly. Friends, the body eventually begins accepting the new emotional signals as familiar. Just as it once memorized stress, it can learn gratitude. Just as it once practiced frustration, it can learn calm. Just as it once repeated fear, it can learn confidence. This is emotional reconditioning. At first, the body may resist. Old habits may try to pull you back into familiar reactions. Yet persistence gradually shifts the balance. Each time you maintain awareness instead of surrendering to automatic emotion, the old program loses strength. A new identity quietly begins forming. Something beautiful starts happening during this transformation. The body begins trusting the mind again. Instead of demanding familiar chemicals from the past, the body begins responding to new emotional signals created intentionally through thought and awareness. The mind becomes the leader once more. Friends, this is when the mind-body connection becomes a powerful instrument of change. Your thoughts shape your brain. Your brain influences your emotions. Your emotions signal your body. Your body then reinforces the state of being that shapes your life. When all of these elements align, thought, emotion, awareness, and intention, the entire system begins working together toward transformation. Life begins feeling different. Situations that once triggered automatic reactions now feel like opportunities for conscious response. Challenges become moments of growth rather than reminders of the past. The body becomes less reactive and more responsive. Energy shifts. Friends, energy is simply information moving through the body. Every emotion carries a different energetic signature. Stress contracts the system, narrowing perception and focusing attention on survival. Elevated emotions such as gratitude, compassion, and inspiration expand the system, allowing the brain to perceive new possibilities. When you practice elevated emotions intentionally, your body enters a state of coherence. The heart rhythm becomes smoother, brain waves shift into more balanced patterns, and the nervous system begins operating with greater harmony. In this state, the body is no longer trapped in survival mode. It begins entering creation mode. Friends, imagine living each day from that state, where your emotions are not dictated by circumstances, but generated from conscious awareness. Imagine waking up and deciding how you will feel before the world tells you how to feel. This is where true freedom begins. The body is no longer chained to the past. The subconscious mind begins rewriting itself. New neural circuits form, new emotional patterns emerge, and gradually the person you once were fades into the background. Something new stands in its place, a self created intentionally, a mind that guides the body rather than being controlled by it, a presence that feels calmer, clearer, and more aware. Friends, transformation does not happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolds quietly, breath by breath, thought by thought, awareness by awareness. Yet every time you choose consciousness over habit, every time you observe an emotion instead of reacting automatically, every time you imagine a better version of yourself and feel it as real, you take another step beyond the old identity. The body slowly releases its grip on the past. The mind begins opening to possibility. And somewhere within that quiet shift, a new version of you begins to breathe. The past is a place of reference, not a place of residence. Friends, pause with that idea for a moment, because so much of human behavior revolves around something that no longer physically exists. The past is gone. Those moments have dissolved into memory. Those conversations have faded into echoes. Those circumstances are no longer present in the world around you. Yet for many people, the past continues to live vividly inside the mind, shaping thoughts, emotions, and expectations as if it were still happening today. This is where the concept of time becomes deeply psychological. Time is not only measured by clocks or calendars. Time is also measured by memory and anticipation. The brain is constantly moving between what has already happened and what might happen next. It remembers experiences from yesterday, last year, even decades ago, and those memories influence the way it predicts tomorrow. Yet something fascinating occurs when the mind becomes trapped between these two directions. Life begins unfolding on autopilot. Friends, think about how often your thoughts drift into the past. A mistake you made, a moment that embarrassed you, a painful conversation, a loss, a failure. The brain replays these memories with astonishing detail. It reconstructs the images, the sounds, the emotions that once existed in that moment. What is extraordinary is that when the brain remembers an event vividly, it releases many of the same chemicals that were present during the original experience. The body reacts again. The heart rate may change, muscles tighten, breathing shifts, emotions return. Your body begins feeling the past as if it were happening now. From the body's perspective, the past is still alive. Friends, this is how people become emotionally anchored to experiences that happened long ago. The brain replays the memory, the body reproduces the emotion, and together they create a feedback loop that keeps the past active inside the present moment. At the same time, the mind performs another remarkable function. It imagines the future. The same brain that remembers yesterday also tries to predict tomorrow. It scans past experiences to determine what might happen next. If you have experienced disappointment before, the mind may expect disappointment again. If fear once appeared in a certain situation, the brain may anticipate fear returning in similar circumstances. This predictive function helped humans survive for thousands of years. Anticipating danger allowed early humans to prepare for threats before they appeared. Yet in modern life, this survival mechanism often becomes a psychological prison. Friends, many people spend enormous amounts of mental energy imagining negative futures based on past experiences that no longer exist. The brain predicts failure because it remembers failure. It anticipates rejection because it remembers rejection. The future becomes nothing more than the past projected forward. This is the moment where time begins controlling identity. A person who constantly thinks about past mistakes begins identifying as someone who fails. Someone who repeatedly remembers emotional pain begins believing that pain is part of who they are. Gradually, the mind creates a narrative, a personal story that defines the self. I am the person this happened to. I am the one who struggles. I am the one who always feels this way. Friends, when identity becomes tied to past experiences, the mind unknowingly recreates those experiences again and again. The brain fires the same neural circuits. The body produces the same emotional chemistry, and life begins reflecting the same patterns. The past becomes the blueprint of the future. Breaking free from this pattern requires a profound shift in awareness. Transformation begins the moment you recognize that the past exists only as memory inside your nervous system. It is not happening now. It is simply information stored in neural networks and emotional patterns. Friends, this realization opens a powerful doorway. The present moment. The present moment is the only place where change can actually occur. The past cannot be altered. The future has not yet arrived. But right now, in this quiet space of awareness, the brain has the ability to choose a different thought. This is where neuroscience and mindfulness intersect beautifully. When your attention moves fully into the present moment, the brain shifts out of its automatic memory-based patterns. Instead of replaying old experiences or predicting future problems, the mind begins observing what is happening right now. Breath moving through the body, sounds appearing and fading, sensations rising and dissolving, thoughts drifting across the mind like clouds across the sky. Friends, this simple act of observing the present moment begins changing the brain. Neural circuits associated with habitual thinking grow quieter, while regions responsible for awareness and emotional regulation become more active. The mind begins loosening its attachment to time. Meditation plays an essential role in this transformation. During meditation, you practice stepping outside the constant movement of past and future. You sit quietly and watch your thoughts without chasing them. Memories may appear, plans may arise, emotions may surface, yet instead of following them into their stories, you observe them gently. Each moment of observation weakens the automatic grip of the past. Something beautiful begins unfolding. The mind discovers stillness. Friends, stillness is not empty. Stillness is full of possibility. In the absence of constant mental noise, the brain becomes capable of imagining new realities rather than repeating old ones. This is where the concept of mental rehearsal becomes incredibly powerful. The brain possesses an extraordinary ability to simulate experiences that have not yet happened. When you imagine a future event vividly, the neural circuits associated with that event begin activating as if the experience were real. The brain starts preparing for the future you are imagining. Friends, this means that you are not limited to learning only from the past. You can also learn from the future you envision. Imagine rehearsing a new identity within your mind. Imagine responding to challenges with calm confidence rather than anxiety. Imagine speaking with clarity instead of hesitation. Imagine feeling gratitude rather than stress. Each time you mentally rehearse these experiences, the brain begins wiring itself accordingly. Neurons that fire together begin wiring together. New neural circuits form. Old circuits that once represented past identities gradually weaken from lack of use. Friends, this process represents one of the most hopeful discoveries in neuroscience, neuroplasticity. The brain is not fixed. It is constantly adapting to what you think, feel, and imagine. This means your future identity is not predetermined by your past experiences. You can literally train your brain to become someone new. Something fascinating happens when you consistently imagine a future that excites you. Your brain begins releasing neurotransmitters associated with curiosity, motivation, and inspiration. The body responds by producing elevated emotional states such as hope, gratitude, and enthusiasm. These emotions carry powerful energy. Stress contracts the body, narrowing attention toward survival. Elevated emotions expand perception, allowing the brain to see possibilities beyond immediate circumstances. Friends, elevated emotions signal to the body that the future you are imagining is already meaningful. The body begins aligning with that vision. Instead of living emotionally in the past, the body starts experiencing the chemistry of the future. This is how time begins shifting inside the mind. Rather than remembering who you used to be, you start rehearsing who you are becoming. Each day your thoughts become slightly different. Your emotional reactions begin softening. Your awareness grows stronger. Gradually the mind stops being a prisoner of time. Friends, imagine living in a state where the present moment becomes your creative canvas. The past is acknowledged but no longer controlling you. The future is envisioned but no longer feared. Your attention rests calmly in the now, where new thoughts can emerge freely. In that space, identity becomes fluid. You begin responding to life from intention rather than habit. Situations that once triggered old memories now feel like opportunities for conscious choice. The mind becomes less reactive and more creative. Something subtle yet powerful begins happening. The brain reorganizes itself around possibility instead of memory. Friends, the human mind is capable of extraordinary transformation when it stops measuring life only through the lens of past experiences. The moment you realize that the present is a doorway rather than a repetition of yesterday, your relationship with time changes forever. The past becomes wisdom instead of weight. The future becomes vision instead of worry. And somewhere within the quiet awareness of the present moment, a new version of you begins taking shape. One thought, one breath, one conscious moment at a time. When you live in survival long enough, it stops feeling like stress and starts feeling like life. Friends, that realization can be both unsettling and liberating at the same time. Because many people move through their days believing they are simply living normally, handling responsibilities, reacting to circumstances, managing problems as they arise. Yet beneath that surface routine, something deeper may be shaping their entire experience of reality. The body may be living in survival mode. Survival mode is not always dramatic. It does not always look like running from danger or facing immediate threats. In modern life, survival often appears quietly, disguised as busyness, worry, frustration, competition, comparison, urgency, and constant mental noise. The nervous system becomes so accustomed to operating in this heightened state that the body begins to believe this is the natural way to live. Stress becomes the baseline. Friends, the human brain evolved to protect the body from danger. When a threat appears, the brain instantly activates the stress response. Hormones like adrenaline and cortisol surge through the bloodstream, preparing the body to react quickly. Blood moves away from long-term systems like digestion and immune repair, redirecting energy toward muscles and rapid thinking. In ancient times, this response helped humans escape predators, climb trees, or fight off danger. Once the threat disappeared, the body relaxed and returned to balance. But modern stress rarely ends so quickly. Emails continue arriving. Deadlines stack up. Financial concerns linger. Social pressures accumulate. News cycles deliver constant signals of danger. The brain interprets many of these signals as threats, even though no physical danger is present. The stress response stays activated. Friends, when stress becomes chronic, something profound begins happening inside the body and brain. Instead of experiencing brief bursts of survival energy, the nervous system begins living there permanently. The body becomes chemically addicted to survival. Adrenaline sharpens attention. Cortisol increases alertness. These chemicals create a sense of urgency that can feel strangely familiar, even stimulating. Over time, the body begins expecting that chemical intensity, just as it once expected emotional patterns tied to past experiences. The mind starts producing thoughts that match those emotions. Suddenly, the brain begins scanning the environment constantly for problems, threats, frustrations, or conflicts. Attention narrows. Creativity shrinks. The brain becomes focused on one goal above all else, staying alive and avoiding danger. This is the psychological landscape of survival. Friends, survival mode places the mind in a very specific relationship with the world. Attention becomes anchored to three things: the body, the environment, time. The body becomes the center of attention because it is the vessel that must survive. Every sensation, every discomfort, every symptom becomes amplified. The mind constantly checks the body for signs of safety or threat. The environment becomes important because it contains potential dangers. People, places, situations, and objects are constantly evaluated for risk. The brain scans the external world endlessly, trying to control circumstances to maintain safety. Time becomes urgent because survival requires predicting what might happen next. The brain replays past experiences to avoid repeating mistakes and anticipates future outcomes to prevent harm. Friends, when consciousness becomes locked into body, environment, and time, the mind has little energy left for imagination, curiosity, or possibility. Life becomes reactive. Yet within every human brain lies another powerful mode of existence: creation. Creation is fundamentally different from survival. When the brain enters a creative state, the nervous system shifts away from stress chemistry. Instead of adrenaline and cortisol dominating the body, other neurochemicals begin influencing the system: dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, signals associated with inspiration, connection, curiosity, and motivation. The brain literally changes its operating system. Friends, creativity expands attention rather than narrowing it. Instead of scanning for danger, the mind begins exploring possibilities. Instead of reacting to circumstances, the mind begins shaping experiences intentionally. Creation requires a different state of consciousness. The shift between survival and creation often begins with awareness. The moment you recognize that your thoughts are driven by stress rather than intention, you gain a powerful opportunity to step outside the pattern. Meditation becomes an extraordinary tool here. When you sit quietly and observe your thoughts, you begin noticing how frequently the mind jumps toward problems, worries, judgments, and comparisons. These patterns are not random. They are survival-based programs running automatically inside the brain. Observation interrupts the program. Friends, the moment you become aware of a thought pattern, the brain's automatic circuitry pauses. You are no longer completely identified with the thought. You become the observer rather than the reactor. This small shift creates mental space. Within that space, something remarkable becomes possible: choice. You can choose a different thought. You can choose a different emotional response. You can choose to imagine something that does not yet exist. This is the beginning of creation. Friends, the brain's frontal lobe plays a critical role in this transformation. This region is responsible for imagination, planning, self-reflection, and intentional behavior. When you activate this part of the brain through focused attention and mental rehearsal, it begins orchestrating new neural patterns that were not present before. You begin designing a future rather than repeating a past. Mental rehearsal becomes especially powerful in this process. When you imagine a new experience vividly, speaking confidently, acting with patience, responding with calm, the brain activates neural circuits associated with that behavior. It is practicing the future. Neurons begin wiring together around this imagined identity. Emotional signals accompany the mental images. The body starts feeling the emotions of that future reality before it physically occurs. Friends, this is where survival begins transforming into creation. Instead of allowing the environment to determine your emotional state, you generate emotions internally through thought and imagination. Instead of reacting to past experiences, you begin rehearsing new possibilities. The body slowly learns a new chemistry. Gratitude replaces tension. Curiosity replaces fear. Inspiration replaces urgency. These elevated emotions create a powerful biological shift. The heart rhythm becomes more coherent. The brain's electrical activity becomes more synchronized. The nervous system enters a state where creativity and learning become easier. Friends, the body begins moving out of survival mode. This transformation may feel subtle at first. Small moments of awareness appear during the day. A stressful situation arises, yet instead of reacting automatically, you pause. You breathe. You observe the emotional signal rising within the body. The old program tries to activate, but something new is present now. Consciousness. You recognize the pattern. You choose a different response. Perhaps calm instead of frustration. Curiosity instead of judgment. Gratitude instead of complaint. Each time this happens, the brain strengthens the neural pathways of creation. Each time it happens, the survival program weakens slightly. Friends, identity begins shifting through these repeated moments of awareness. The person who once lived entirely in reaction begins living with intention. Thoughts become more deliberate. Emotional reactions become more flexible. Life begins feeling different. The environment no longer feels like something that must be controlled constantly. Time no longer feels like a relentless race toward the next problem. The body becomes less tense, less reactive, more open to experience. Creation replaces survival as the guiding force. Something extraordinary begins unfolding inside the mind when this shift stabilizes. The brain stops expecting stress as the default state. Instead, it becomes comfortable with openness, curiosity, and possibility. You begin waking up each day with a different internal signal. Friends, imagine starting the day not with urgency or worry but with awareness. Imagine noticing the breath before reaching for your phone. Imagine feeling gratitude before the first task begins. Imagine setting an intention for how you will think, feel, and respond throughout the day. This is not wishful thinking. This is neurological training. The brain gradually reorganizes itself around the states you practice most often. If survival dominates daily life, the brain strengthens survival circuits. If creativity, gratitude, and awareness are practiced repeatedly, the brain strengthens those pathways instead. Neuroplasticity makes transformation possible. Friends, the human mind is not fixed. It is an evolving system constantly reshaping itself according to experience and attention. Every thought influences neural activity. Every emotion sends chemical signals throughout the body. Every moment of awareness changes the relationship between mind and environment. This means the difference between survival and creation is not determined by circumstances alone. It is determined by consciousness. When awareness becomes strong enough, the old survival programs lose their grip. Stress no longer dictates every reaction. The environment no longer defines identity. Time no longer traps the mind in endless cycles of past and future. Something quieter begins guiding life. Presence. Friends, presence opens the door to a new way of being. The body relaxes into the moment. The mind becomes curious instead of defensive. Creativity flows more easily because attention is no longer trapped by fear or urgency. Life starts unfolding like a canvas waiting for color. The remarkable truth is that this shift does not require escaping the world. The same responsibilities remain. Work continues. Relationships continue. Challenges still appear. Yet the internal experience changes dramatically. Instead of surviving the day, you begin creating within it. Thought by thought, emotion by emotion, moment by moment. And somewhere in that quiet transition, between the fading echoes of survival and the emerging rhythm of creation, a different kind of life begins to take shape. One guided not by fear of what might happen, but by vision of what could be. Knowledge is only potential power. Transformation begins the moment knowledge becomes experience. Friends, that simple idea carries a profound truth about how the human brain evolves. Many people spend years collecting information, reading books, listening to lectures, studying psychology, neuroscience, and personal development, hoping that knowledge alone will transform their lives. Yet something curious often happens. The mind understands new ideas, but behavior remains the same. Insight appears briefly, but old habits quietly return. The reason lies deep within the architecture of the brain itself. The human brain does not operate as a single uniform system. It works more like a beautifully coordinated network of different regions, each playing a unique role in shaping how we learn, act, and ultimately become the person we are. Understanding this process opens a fascinating doorway into personal transformation. Friends, imagine the brain as three interconnected stages of evolution, each responsible for a different layer of experience: thinking, doing, and being. The journey of change begins in the first stage, the thinking brain. The thinking brain, often associated with the neocortex, is the seat of intellect, reasoning, imagination, and conscious awareness. This part of the brain allows you to analyze ideas, consider possibilities, and reflect on who you are and who you want to become. When you read inspiring ideas about personal growth, when you learn about neuroscience or mindfulness, when you imagine a better future for yourself, this is the region doing the work. The thinking brain gathers information and begins constructing new mental models. Friends, every time you learn something new, neurons begin forming fresh connections. The brain is constantly reorganizing itself, weaving networks of understanding that represent the knowledge you absorb. When you encounter a powerful idea, perhaps the realization that thoughts influence emotions or that habits shape identity, the thinking brain records that insight as a new pattern of neural activity. Yet knowledge alone does not change identity. Many people understand what they should do differently. They know they should exercise more, react with patience, speak kindly, focus on gratitude, meditate regularly, pursue meaningful goals. The thinking brain recognizes these possibilities clearly. But the real challenge begins when the mind tries to translate knowledge into action. Friends, this is where the second stage of the brain becomes essential, the doing brain. The doing brain, often associated with the limbic system, is the center of emotional experience and behavioral learning. This region takes intellectual ideas and converts them into lived experiences. When you attempt something new, practicing meditation, responding calmly instead of reacting with anger, choosing gratitude instead of complaint, the doing brain becomes active. It learns through experience. Experience produces emotion. Emotion produces chemical signals within the body. Those signals strengthen neural circuits in the brain, reinforcing the behavior that created them. This is how learning moves from theory into reality. Imagine someone reading about patience in a book. The thinking brain understands the concept. Yet true learning occurs when that person faces a stressful situation and consciously chooses patience instead of frustration. In that moment, the experience generates a new emotional pattern. The limbic brain registers that feeling and sends chemical messages throughout the body. Those signals reinforce the neural circuits associated with the new behavior. Friends, repeated experiences gradually transform knowledge into familiarity. This is how habits begin forming. Each time you practice a new behavior, the brain strengthens the neural pathways responsible for that action. Neurons that fire together begin wiring together. The more frequently those circuits activate, the more automatic the behavior becomes. Yet something remarkable happens when the brain practices a behavior long enough. It moves into the third stage of transformation, being. The being brain, often associated with the cerebellum, represents the level where actions become automatic expressions of identity. This region stores deeply learned behaviors and emotional states so that they no longer require conscious effort. Think about learning to drive a car. In the beginning, the thinking brain works intensely, paying attention to mirrors, pedals, traffic signals, steering, and timing. The process feels complicated and mentally demanding. With practice, the doing brain takes over through experience. The movements become smoother, the reactions quicker, the emotional confidence grows. Eventually, driving becomes natural. Friends, the cerebellum stores that mastery. The behavior moves into the being level of the brain. You no longer think about every step. Your body knows what to do. Transformation works the same way. When you first learn about self-awareness, meditation, or emotional regulation, the thinking brain becomes excited by the possibilities. You imagine a new version of yourself, calmer, more focused, more confident, more compassionate. Then comes the practice. You sit quietly in meditation even when the mind resists. You pause before reacting during difficult conversations. You choose gratitude when the environment encourages frustration. These repeated experiences gradually teach the body a new emotional language. Friends, eventually the brain begins encoding those experiences deeply within the cerebellum. The new emotional state becomes automatic. The calm response appears naturally. Gratitude arises without effort. Compassion replaces judgment. This is the moment when knowledge becomes being. Something extraordinary happens when a person reaches this level of transformation. Their personality begins changing from the inside out. Personality is simply a collection of thoughts, behaviors, and emotional reactions repeated consistently over time. When those elements change, personality evolves. Friends, change your personality and you change your personal reality. The brain plays a remarkable role in this process through neuroplasticity. Every time you practice a new thought or emotional response, the brain reorganizes itself physically. Neural networks expand, strengthen, and integrate with other regions of the brain. The mind becomes wired for the future rather than the past. Yet the journey from thinking to doing to being requires patience. The brain cannot transform instantly because old neural circuits have been reinforced through years of repetition. Habits have deep biological roots. Emotional conditioning has trained the body to expect familiar chemical signals. Breaking those patterns requires persistence. Friends, imagine learning to play a musical instrument. The first attempts feel awkward. Fingers stumble across the keys or strings. The mind struggles to coordinate movements. Yet each practice session strengthens the brain's circuits for that skill. Eventually, music flows effortlessly. Transformation of identity follows the same principle. Meditation becomes one of the most powerful tools in this process because it allows the thinking brain to observe old patterns before the doing brain automatically repeats them. During meditation, you sit quietly and watch your thoughts without acting on them. This observation interrupts the habitual loop. The moment you notice an old emotional pattern rising, frustration, fear, self-doubt, you gain the opportunity to choose differently. Instead of reinforcing the old reaction, you consciously create a new response. Friends, each conscious interruption rewires the brain slightly. At first, the changes may feel small. A moment of calm instead of anger. A pause instead of a complaint. A feeling of gratitude where irritation once appeared. Yet those small shifts accumulate. The doing brain records each experience. Emotional chemistry changes. The body learns that new responses are possible. Gradually, the being brain absorbs those experiences and stores them as a new identity. Friends, imagine waking up one day and realizing that situations which once triggered stress now inspire curiosity. Imagine responding to challenges with clarity rather than panic. Imagine feeling gratitude naturally, without forcing it. This is the stage of being. The brain has fully integrated the new patterns. Thoughts, emotions, and actions align with the person you have been practicing in your mind. Something deeper begins emerging from this alignment. Authenticity. When the thinking brain, doing brain, and being brain work together harmoniously, the inner world becomes coherent. Thoughts match actions. Emotions support intentions. The body reflects the vision held by the mind. life begins feeling purposeful. Friends, the journey from thinking to doing to being is the neurological pathway of transformation. Knowledge ignites the process. Experience strengthens it. Embodiment completes it. Every time you learn a new idea about growth, the thinking brain expands. Every time you practice that idea in real life, the doing brain reinforces it. Every time you repeat the experience consistently, the being brain integrates it into identity. The process may feel gradual, yet its effects become profound. The mind becomes calmer. The body becomes healthier. Relationships become more authentic. Opportunities begin appearing where limitations once existed. Friends, the brain is not merely an organ reacting to the world. It is an extraordinary instrument capable of designing a new self through awareness and practice. Within its networks lies the ability to transform thoughts into experiences and experiences into identity. Every moment you choose awareness over habit, you strengthen the pathway from thinking to doing. Every time you repeat that conscious choice, you strengthen the pathway from doing to being. Slowly, quietly, the person you once were begins dissolving. A new identity emerges, a mind that understands possibility, a body that feels aligned with intention, a presence that radiates calm confidence and clarity. Friends, somewhere within that beautiful process, between the thoughts you choose, the actions you practice, and the identity you embody, the extraordinary power of the human brain reveals itself. Transformation is not something reserved for rare individuals or distant dreams. It is a neurological journey available to anyone willing to think differently, practice intentionally, and become the person they imagine within. The greatest prison is not the world outside you. It is the identity you pretend to be while hiding who you really are. Friends, that idea may feel a little uncomfortable at first because it gently shines a light on something many of us quietly carry within ourselves. Every human being, at some point in life, develops a difference between two versions of the self, the one we show to the world and the one we experience privately when the noise of life becomes silent. This difference is what many psychologists describe as the invisible distance within identity, a space, a separation, a quiet divide between appearance and authenticity. That space is what we can call the gap. For many people, the gap begins forming early in life. As children grow, they learn quickly how the world responds to different behaviors. Certain emotions are welcomed, others are discouraged. Certain qualities receive praise, others receive criticism. Gradually, the young mind begins shaping a version of itself designed to fit the expectations of the environment. The brain learns to adapt. Friends, the brain is an extraordinary organ of survival. It constantly analyzes experiences and develops patterns that help us belong, succeed, and protect ourselves emotionally. When a child feels rejected, embarrassed, or misunderstood, the brain records that experience deeply within neural circuits and emotional memory. The body remembers those feelings. Over time, the mind quietly begins constructing a protective identity, a personality designed to be accepted, a version of the self crafted to appear confident, capable, strong, successful, or happy. Yet beneath that carefully designed surface, another layer of experience may still exist. The real emotions, the private thoughts, the quiet insecurities, the feelings that remain hidden when the world is watching. Friends, imagine holding two hands in front of you. One hand represents how you appear to the world, the personality you project through your actions, achievements, social roles, and public image. The other hand represents how you truly feel when life becomes quiet. The emotions that surface when you sit alone without distractions. The distance between those two hands is the gap. For some people, that gap is small. Their external identity reflects their internal reality fairly closely. What you see on the outside resembles what exists inside. For others, the gap becomes much wider. Life experiences, emotional conditioning, and social expectations create layers of behavior designed to hide vulnerability. The personality becomes a mask, not out of deception, but out of protection. Friends, the mind learns to cover discomfort with achievement, insecurity with confidence, loneliness with busyness, uncertainty with control. From the outside, everything may appear perfectly successful. Yet when the external stimulation disappears, when the phone is quiet, the workday ends, the audience leaves, the distractions fade, the mind sometimes encounters something unexpected, an uneasy silence, a feeling that something is missing, a quiet awareness that the image presented to the world may not fully represent the person inside. This realization can feel unsettling, yet it is also the beginning of profound transformation, because awareness of the gap is the first step toward closing it. Friends, the gap exists largely because of memorized emotional patterns stored in the brain and body. Experiences from the past create emotional imprints, feelings of shame, anger, fear, guilt, self-doubt, or inadequacy. These emotions become familiar states of being that the nervous system learns to recognize. Over time, the body becomes conditioned to those emotional signals. The personality then organizes itself around them. Someone who has memorized feelings of unworthiness may overcompensate by appearing overly confident or constantly seeking approval. Someone who carries hidden fear may create a persona of control or perfection. Someone who feels unresolved sadness may pursue endless distractions to avoid quiet moments of reflection. Friends, the brain is incredibly skilled at maintaining this arrangement. It develops automatic behaviors designed to preserve the image we want the world to see. Social roles, professional achievements, possessions, relationships, and external validation become tools that reinforce the projected identity. The environment becomes a mirror reminding us who we think we are. When people respond to our personality in familiar ways, the brain receives confirmation that the identity is real. The emotional patterns associated with that identity are reinforced again and again. Yet beneath all of those layers, the deeper self remains quietly present. Sometimes it reveals itself during moments of solitude. Sometimes during periods of emotional exhaustion. Sometimes during a moment of deep reflection when the mind finally pauses long enough to ask a powerful question. Who am I when no one else is watching? Friends, that question carries enormous psychological power. It invites the thinking brain, the frontal lobe, to observe the personality with honesty and curiosity. This ability to observe the self is known as metacognition. It allows you to step outside your habitual patterns and see them clearly. When this happens, something remarkable begins unfolding inside the brain. Neural circuits that once operated automatically are brought into conscious awareness. Patterns that once ran invisibly become visible. The observer awakens. Friends, the observer is the doorway to change. When consciousness becomes aware of the gap between appearance and authenticity, the mind gains the ability to reshape identity intentionally. Instead of continuing to reinforce the old personality, the brain begins questioning it. Why do I react this way? Why do I feel the need to maintain this image? What emotions am I trying to hide? What experiences shape these patterns? These questions activate the brain's higher reasoning centers, allowing new neural pathways to form. Awareness becomes the tool that loosens the grip of old emotional conditioning. Yet this process requires courage. Closing the gap means facing aspects of ourselves that have been carefully hidden for years. It means acknowledging emotions we once avoided, admitting patterns we once justified, and seeing the personality with compassion rather than judgment. Friends, honesty with oneself releases enormous energy. Maintaining a false identity requires constant effort. The brain must continuously manage behavior, reactions, and expressions to maintain the appearance. That effort consumes attention and emotional energy. When the gap begins closing, that energy becomes available again. It can now be directed toward growth rather than protection. Meditation becomes a powerful ally in this transformation. During meditation, the mind gently withdraws attention from the environment, the body, and the endless stream of external stimulation. In that quiet space, familiar emotions and thoughts begin surfacing naturally. Instead of suppressing them, you observe them. Instead of identifying with them, you witness them. Friends, this practice gradually dissolves the illusion that these emotions define who you are. They are simply patterns stored within the nervous system, memories expressed through chemistry. The observer begins separating consciousness from conditioning. Something extraordinary begins happening within the brain when this separation becomes clear. The emotional charges that once reinforced the gap begin losing their power. Old memories release their intensity. Habitual reactions weaken. The personality becomes flexible. The mind begins imagining a different version of the self, a self that does not rely on external validation to feel complete, a self whose internal emotions align with outward behavior, a self that feels authentic. Friends, authenticity is not about perfection. It is about alignment. When how you appear matches how you truly feel, the gap disappears. The mind and body operate in harmony. Thoughts, emotions, and actions move in the same direction. This state produces a powerful psychological experience. Wholeness. When the inner world and outer expression align, the brain no longer needs constant external stimulation to maintain identity. Emotional stability comes from within rather than from circumstances. Joy becomes less dependent on events. Confidence becomes less dependent on approval. Peace becomes less dependent on control. Friends, this is the quiet freedom that emerges when the gap closes. The energy once used to maintain appearances becomes available for creativity, growth, and connection. Relationships deepen because communication becomes more genuine. Goals become clearer because they are no longer driven by insecurity. Life begins feeling lighter. The mind no longer carries the weight of pretending. Something even more profound begins unfolding at this stage. When the gap disappears, the brain stops dividing attention between maintaining an image and hiding emotions. The entire system becomes coherent. Thoughts support feelings. Feelings support actions. Actions reflect identity. Friends, coherence creates a powerful internal signal that influences how we experience the world. The nervous system becomes calmer, the mind becomes clearer, and intuition becomes easier to access. In that state, the person you present to the world is no longer a mask. It is simply you. And in the quiet space where the old identity once struggled to hold itself together, a new sense of authenticity begins to breathe, gentle, honest, and whole. The mystic is not a special person. The mystic is simply a human being who has learned how to move beyond the limits of the senses. That idea opens the door to one of the most fascinating discoveries about the human mind. For centuries, people believed that mystical experiences belonged only to monks, saints, or spiritual masters who lived in remote mountains or quiet temples. Those moments of deep awareness, profound peace, and expanded consciousness seemed rare, mysterious, almost supernatural. Yet modern neuroscience and psychology reveal something extraordinary. Those states are not supernatural. They are natural. They are built into the design of the human brain. What makes them seem mystical is simply that most people never learn how to access them. And the key that opens this doorway is meditation. Friends, when most people hear the word meditation, they imagine something abstract or complicated, something reserved for spiritual traditions or ancient philosophies. But meditation, when we look at it through the lens of neuroscience, is something beautifully practical. It is the process of changing your brain and body so you can step out of the familiar identity of the past and enter the creative possibilities of the future. To understand how this works, we first need to understand how the brain normally functions during everyday life. Most people spend their waking hours operating in what scientists call beta brain waves. These are fast, high-frequency brain patterns associated with analyzing, thinking, planning, reacting, and focusing on the external environment. In this state, the mind is constantly paying attention to the outside world. The brain is busy processing conversations, responsibilities, problems, deadlines, social interactions, financial concerns, and countless sensory inputs. The environment becomes the dominant influence on our thinking. Friends, when the brain remains in high beta for long periods of time, something subtle begins happening. The mind becomes overly focused on survival. Stress hormones circulate through the body. Thoughts become repetitive and predictable. The brain starts operating in patterns of anxiety, frustration, worry, or urgency. This is the state most people live in every day. The mind becomes addicted to the emotions of survival. And when we live in that state constantly, something important becomes difficult: creativity. Because creativity requires a different kind of brain activity. Meditation gently shifts the brain out of that fast survival state and moves it into slower, more coherent patterns of awareness. When you close your eyes and withdraw attention from the outside world, the brain begins reducing sensory input. The analytical mind quiets down, and electrical activity in the brain starts slowing naturally. The first shift occurs when the brain moves into alpha waves. Alpha is a relaxed, calm state of awareness. In alpha, the mind is still awake and conscious, yet the body begins to relax deeply. Thoughts become slower, clearer, and more organized. Creativity becomes easier because the brain is no longer reacting to constant external stimulation. Friends, alpha is the bridge between the conscious mind and the deeper layers of the subconscious. Yet meditation can take the mind even further. With practice, attention continues settling inward, and the brain begins entering the theta state. Theta is one of the most powerful mental states for transformation. In theta, the body becomes deeply relaxed, almost as if it were asleep, while the mind remains aware. In this state, the barrier between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind begins dissolving. That barrier normally exists because the analytical mind filters information and protects existing beliefs. But when the analytical mind becomes quiet during meditation, the subconscious mind opens. Friends, this is where real change begins. Because the subconscious mind is where our habits live. It is where emotional memories are stored. It is where automatic behaviors, belief systems, and conditioned reactions are programmed. Scientists estimate that roughly 95% of who we are operates at the subconscious level, while only about 5% of our mind functions consciously through logic and reasoning. This explains something many people experience. They consciously want to change. They want to think positively. They want to become more confident, more patient, more focused, more successful. Yet their behaviors continue repeating the same patterns. Why? Because the conscious mind is trying to change something that the subconscious mind has already memorized. Meditation solves this problem by allowing awareness to reach into the subconscious operating system. Friends, imagine your mind as a vast computer program running thousands of automatic patterns. Meditation is the moment when you finally gain access to the control panel. From that place, you can begin installing new patterns, new thoughts, new emotional responses, new identities. Yet something even more fascinating happens during deep meditation. The sense of identity begins dissolving. When you withdraw attention from your body, your environment, and the constant pressure of time, the mind begins experiencing a different dimension of awareness. You are no longer thinking about who you normally are. You forget your name for a moment. You forget your responsibilities. You forget the problems that once seemed so important. The familiar personality temporarily disappears. In that space, something remarkable becomes possible. Creation. Friends, neuroscience suggests that when the brain enters deep coherent states like theta, the mind becomes more receptive to new ideas and experiences. The old emotional patterns stored in the body loosen their grip, and the brain becomes flexible again. It becomes capable of learning a new way of being. This is where the concept of mental rehearsal becomes powerful. When you imagine a new version of yourself during meditation, confident, calm, inspired, successful, compassionate, the brain begins creating neural circuits that represent that future identity. The brain does not always distinguish between an intensely imagined experience and a physical experience. So when you visualize a new life with emotional intensity, the brain begins wiring itself as if that future is already happening. Friends, this is not fantasy. This is neuroplasticity. Neurons that fire together begin wiring together. Each time you mentally rehearse a new behavior or emotional state, the brain strengthens the circuits associated with that identity. Over time, those circuits become familiar, and familiarity becomes personality. Something even deeper occurs when emotion becomes involved. Thoughts send signals through the nervous system, but emotions create powerful chemical responses throughout the body. When you feel gratitude, inspiration, joy, or love during meditation, your body begins releasing neurochemicals that reinforce those emotional states. The body begins learning a new emotional language. Friends, when thought and emotion become aligned, the brain and body begin broadcasting a different energetic signature. Some researchers describe this as an electromagnetic signal created by the combined activity of brain waves and emotional chemistry. When that signal changes, the experiences you attract into your life can begin changing as well. Quantum physics offers a fascinating metaphor for this process. At the quantum level, matter does not exist as solid objects alone. Instead, it exists as waves of probability, potential events waiting to become real. In physics experiments, when an observer measures a particle, the wave collapses into a specific event. Something similar may occur within the human experience. When you place focused attention on a desired future and emotionally embrace it as if it were already happening, you are directing energy toward that possibility. In a sense, you become the observer shaping your own reality. Friends, this does not mean life instantly becomes magical or effortless, but it does mean something important. You are no longer trapped by the past. You are no longer reacting automatically to old emotions and familiar circumstances. Instead, you are consciously participating in the creation of your future. Meditation trains the brain to access this creative state more often. Each time you practice, the brain becomes more familiar with the pathway from survival thinking to creative awareness. Each session becomes easier. Each moment of stillness becomes deeper. Gradually, the mind begins carrying that coherence into daily life. You respond differently to challenges. You feel less controlled by stress. Your attention becomes more intentional. Friends, the mystical experience once described by ancient traditions begins revealing itself as something beautifully practical. It is the moment when the mind becomes quiet enough to experience the deeper intelligence within consciousness. In those moments, you are not defined by your past. You are not limited by your environment. You are not constrained by time. You become pure awareness, the observer of thoughts, the creator of possibilities. From that space, the future is no longer something that happens to you. It becomes something you participate in shaping. And the more often you enter that quiet inner landscape, the more familiar it becomes. What once felt mystical becomes natural. What once seemed impossible becomes imaginable. What once seemed distant begins quietly moving closer. Friends, somewhere between the silence of meditation and the imagination of a new future, a remarkable transformation begins unfolding. The old personality slowly fades. The mind learns new patterns. The body learns new emotions. And within that gentle process of awareness and practice, the waves of possibility that once lived only in imagination begin preparing themselves to arrive in your life. The quieter you become, the more you are able to hear what your future is trying to tell you. Friends, That idea may sound poetic at first, yet beneath those words lives a powerful truth about the human brain, the subconscious mind, and the extraordinary ability we all possess to transform ourselves. Most people spend their entire lives trying to change their circumstances while unknowingly carrying the same thoughts, the same emotional reactions, and the same habits that created those circumstances in the first place. The mind repeats familiar patterns, the body memorizes familiar emotions, and the personality becomes a predictable cycle moving through the same experiences again and again. Real transformation begins when we interrupt that cycle. That interruption is what meditation prepares us to do. I want you to imagine something for a moment, friends. Imagine your mind as a busy city street during rush hour. Cars moving quickly in every direction, horns honking, people rushing, lights flashing, constant movement everywhere. That is how most brains operate during the day. Thoughts moving rapidly, attention jumping from one stimulus to another, worries about the future mixing with memories from the past, emotional reactions appearing automatically. In that state, the brain is focused outward, reacting to the environment, reacting to circumstances, reacting to problems. A mind that constantly reacts rarely creates something new. Creation requires space. Creation requires silence. Creation requires awareness. Meditation begins by gently guiding the brain out of that chaotic traffic and into a quiet, open landscape where observation becomes possible. The purpose is not to escape life, friends. It is to step outside the automatic program long enough to observe it clearly. Because before you can create a new self, you must first become familiar with the one you have been living as. Preparation for meditation is not complicated, yet it is incredibly important. It begins with intention. When you sit down to meditate, you are not simply relaxing or closing your eyes for a few minutes. You are entering a laboratory of consciousness where you will observe the inner architecture of your own mind. Friends, that laboratory exists within you. The moment you decide to meditate, something fascinating begins happening neurologically. Your brain starts shifting attention away from the external environment and turning inward. This simple redirection of awareness already begins changing brain activity. The senses quiet down, the analytical mind slows, and the nervous system gradually moves from survival mode into a more balanced and creative state. Yet preparation requires more than simply sitting still. It requires awareness of the three powerful forces that normally control our thinking: the environment, the body, and time. Most people are deeply conditioned by their environment. Familiar places, familiar faces, familiar routines constantly remind the brain of who it believes you are. Your house, your work environment, your daily schedule, your phone notifications, even the people you interact with every day. All of these cues reinforce the identity you have practiced for years. Meditation temporarily disconnects that influence. By closing your eyes and turning attention inward, you begin reducing the environmental signals that keep the old personality active. In that quiet moment, the brain is no longer being reminded of your past in the same way. Something subtle begins to change. Preparation also involves the body, because the body is often the strongest voice of the past. Every emotional experience you have ever had leaves a chemical imprint inside your nervous system. Over time, those emotional chemicals become familiar, almost addictive. The body learns to crave certain emotional states: stress, frustration, anxiety, even sadness, simply because they are familiar. Friends, this is why people sometimes wake up already feeling worried or irritated without any clear reason. The body has memorized the emotion. During meditation, when you sit quietly and refuse to react to those familiar feelings, the body begins sending signals asking for its usual emotional experience. Thoughts may appear, restlessness may arise, discomfort may surface. The body is simply trying to return to the familiar identity it knows. Preparation means recognizing that this moment will happen. And when it does, instead of reacting, you observe. Observation is one of the most powerful skills a human being can develop. When you observe a thought without believing it, when you notice an emotion without becoming it, something remarkable occurs. You create space between your consciousness and the automatic programs running inside your brain and body. That space is where transformation begins. Friends, the third force we prepare to overcome is time. Most of our thoughts revolve around memories of the past or worries about the future. The mind constantly jumps backward and forward along the timeline of life. Yet meditation invites us into a different experience entirely. The present moment. In the present moment, the brain stops referencing the past identity. The emotional history stored in the body begins losing its control. The personality that was built through years of repetition becomes less dominant. The present moment is the doorway to possibility. When you prepare properly for meditation, something extraordinary becomes possible. You begin observing your thoughts instead of automatically believing them. You notice emotional patterns instead of reacting to them. You recognize habits that once seemed invisible. Friends, that awareness is not weakness. That awareness is power. Because once you see the program clearly, you gain the ability to rewrite it. Preparation also involves something deeply creative, intention combined with elevated emotion. Before entering meditation, it helps to ask yourself a powerful question. Who do I want to become? Not who you have been. Not who your environment expects you to be. Who you choose to become. Maybe the future version of you is calmer, more confident, more focused, more compassionate, more creative, more courageous. When you clearly define that intention, the brain begins forming a mental blueprint. Neuroscience shows that imagining a new behavior activates many of the same neural circuits as actually performing that behavior. When you mentally rehearse a new version of yourself, neurons begin wiring together in new patterns. Friends, the brain starts preparing for a future that has not yet physically happened. Emotion then becomes the energy that powers this blueprint. If you combine a clear intention with feelings such as gratitude, inspiration, or excitement, the body begins experiencing the chemistry of that future state. Thought becomes the electrical signal. Emotion becomes the magnetic signal. Together, they form the energetic language through which the brain and body begin reorganizing themselves. Meditation then becomes the practice ground where this new identity is rehearsed repeatedly. Each session becomes an opportunity to disconnect from the familiar personality and experiment with a new one. Some days the mind will wander. Some days the body will resist. Some days the old habits will feel strong. Friends, that is perfectly normal. The brain has spent years practicing the old identity, and like any habit, it takes time to change. Yet every moment of awareness during meditation is a moment when the old program weakens and the new one grows stronger. Think of meditation like training a muscle that most people never realize they possess, the muscle of conscious awareness. Each time you bring your attention back to the present moment, that muscle grows stronger. Each time you observe a thought instead of reacting, that muscle grows stronger. Each time you sit quietly and choose intention over habit, the architecture of your brain begins changing. Gradually, something incredible begins unfolding. The person you once believed yourself to be starts dissolving. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently, quietly, almost like a fog lifting as the sun rises. Friends, within that quiet space of preparation and awareness, the seeds of a new identity begin taking root. And the more often you enter that inner laboratory of meditation, the more familiar it becomes, until one day the mind that once reacted automatically begins creating intentionally, and the life that once felt predictable begins unfolding in ways that once lived only inside your imagination. Your personality creates your personal reality, and the moment you change your state of mind, you begin opening the door to an entirely new future. Friends, this idea is not just motivational language. It is deeply rooted in neuroscience and the remarkable adaptability of the human brain. Every thought you think, every emotion you repeatedly feel, every reaction you practice day after day slowly wires the neural circuits that shape who you believe you are. Over time, those circuits become automatic patterns, and those patterns form what we call personality. Personality then begins creating the experiences of life. The thoughts you repeat influence the decisions you make. The emotions you feel shape the actions you take, and those actions produce the results you experience in your world. That entire loop becomes familiar, predictable, and comfortable for the brain, even when it leads to outcomes that you wish would change. Transformation begins when you interrupt that loop. This moment, friends, is the doorway to what we can call the creative state. The creative state is a condition of mind where you are no longer reacting to your past identity, but instead consciously designing a new version of yourself. The first week of this practice focuses on something deceptively simple yet profoundly powerful: learning how to move beyond the familiar self and step into a quiet inner space where new possibilities can begin forming. Imagine for a moment that your mind is like a vast theater stage. For years, the same characters have been performing there. Familiar thoughts step forward like actors repeating their rehearsed lines. Familiar emotions follow closely behind them, playing their predictable roles. Stress appears on cue. Doubt walks in confidently. Frustration delivers its lines with perfect timing. The audience watching this play is your awareness. Most people sit quietly in that audience, believing the performance is reality. The creative state begins the moment you realize you are not the actors. You are the observer. Friends, observation changes everything. When you become aware of your thoughts instead of automatically believing them, the brain begins creating a small but powerful gap between the thinker and the thought. Within that gap lives freedom. Freedom to choose differently. Freedom to imagine differently. Freedom to become someone new. Opening the door to the creative state begins with slowing down the mind. Most of our waking life is spent in a fast, analytical mode where the brain is constantly processing the external environment. Responsibilities, conversations, deadlines, problems, notifications. These stimuli keep the brain focused outward, reacting to circumstances rather than creating them. Meditation gently redirects attention inward. When you close your eyes and settle into stillness, the brain begins reducing the flood of sensory information that normally dominates awareness. The analytical mind gradually quiets. Brain waves slow from the rapid activity associated with everyday thinking into calmer, more coherent rhythms. In this quieter neurological state, something remarkable begins happening. The boundary between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind becomes softer. The conscious mind is responsible for logic, reasoning, and short-term focus. The subconscious mind, however, stores habits, emotional memories, belief systems, and automatic behaviors. Most of the personality you express daily lives within this deeper subconscious layer. Friends, when meditation slows the brain, the doorway to that deeper level of mind opens slightly. This is why the first week of practice focuses heavily on observation rather than immediate transformation. Before you can install a new identity, you must become aware of the old programs running quietly beneath the surface. Those programs often appear through thoughts. Perhaps a voice says, "This won't work." Another thought whispers, "You're not disciplined enough." Maybe the mind drifts toward worries about the future or memories of past failures. These thoughts are not random. They are the echoes of neural patterns that have been rehearsed for years. Observation during meditation allows you to notice these patterns without engaging with them. Instead of reacting emotionally, you simply witness them appearing and disappearing like clouds passing across the sky. Friends, something powerful occurs during this process. When a thought arises and you choose not to follow it, the neural circuit responsible for that thought weakens slightly. The brain begins learning that it does not need to run that program automatically. Each moment of observation becomes a small act of freedom. The body also participates in this transformation. For years, the body has memorized emotional states associated with your identity. If you have spent long periods feeling stressed, frustrated, or anxious, the body becomes accustomed to the chemical signals associated with those emotions. During meditation, the body may become restless. It may feel uncomfortable. It may even urge you to stand up, check your phone, or think about something else. Friends, the body is simply asking for the familiar emotional experience it knows. Your role during this week of practice is to gently remind the body that something new is happening. By remaining still and continuing to observe, you teach the body that it no longer needs to live in those old emotional patterns. Gradually, the body begins relaxing. Gradually, the mind becomes quieter. Gradually, awareness becomes clearer. In that quiet space, the creative state begins emerging. The creative state is not forced. It does not appear through effort or struggle. Instead, it unfolds naturally when the noise of the past becomes quiet enough for new possibilities to be heard. Friends, this is where imagination becomes one of the most powerful tools available to the human brain. Imagination is not merely fantasy. Neuroscience shows that when you vividly imagine a new behavior or experience, the brain activates many of the same neural networks that would fire if the event were physically happening. This means the brain can begin learning a future before it arrives. During meditation, you may begin picturing a new version of yourself. Perhaps you imagine waking up feeling calm and focused. Perhaps you see yourself speaking with confidence during an important conversation. Perhaps you feel gratitude for opportunities that have not yet appeared. The key element is emotional engagement. Thoughts create electrical signals in the brain. Emotions generate chemical signals throughout the body. When a clear intention combines with elevated emotion, the brain and body begin broadcasting a different internal state. That state becomes the foundation of a new personality slowly forming beneath the surface. Friends, the creative state is the place where this new personality begins rehearsing its role. It is not necessary to force change immediately in the outer world. Transformation always begins within the invisible landscape of the mind. Each meditation session becomes a rehearsal where the brain learns new patterns and the body learns new emotions. With repetition, those patterns strengthen. Neural connections grow. Belief systems begin shifting. Gradually, the identity that once felt permanent begins loosening its grip. Something quiet but profound unfolds during this first stage of the journey. You begin recognizing that your thoughts are not who you are. Your emotions are not who you are. Your past experiences are not who you are. You are the awareness capable of observing all of them. Friends, this realization opens a door that many people spend their entire lives searching for. Behind that door exists the freedom to design your inner world intentionally rather than reacting to it automatically. The more often you practice entering this creative state, the more natural it becomes. The mind begins remembering how to settle into stillness. The body learns to relax without demanding familiar emotions. Awareness becomes clearer and more spacious. Eventually, the observer becomes stronger than the old personality. And in that moment, something new quietly begins taking shape inside your mind. A new self, a new story, a new future waiting patiently for the day you fully step through the door you have just begun opening. The moment you stop rehearsing who you used to be, you begin creating space for who you can become. Friends, that idea carries a quiet but revolutionary power. Most people believe change requires adding something new to their lives. New habits, new goals, new strategies. Yet, deep transformation often begins in the opposite direction. It begins with subtraction. It begins with gently removing the patterns that keep the old identity alive. Think about a tree for a moment. A healthy tree grows because branches are occasionally pruned. The gardener removes the parts that no longer serve the plant so that new life can emerge stronger and more vibrant. Without pruning, the The tree becomes crowded with old growth that blocks sunlight and limits expansion. The human mind works in a very similar way. The habits that define your personality are like branches that have grown through years of repetition. Every thought you repeat, every emotion you practice, every reaction you reinforce strengthens certain neural circuits inside your brain. Those circuits become familiar pathways that the mind travels automatically. Over time, those pathways become your identity. Friends, when we speak about pruning the habit of being yourself, we are not talking about losing who you are. We are talking about removing the automatic patterns that prevent you from becoming who you are capable of being. During the first stage of this journey, you learned to open the door to the creative state. You began observing your thoughts rather than blindly following them. You discovered that awareness itself can interrupt the automatic programs running inside the brain. That awareness now becomes the tool that allows deeper transformation to unfold. Week 2 focuses on something both simple and powerful, recognizing and releasing the patterns that keep your old personality alive. The brain is designed for efficiency. Once it learns a behavior or emotional response, it prefers repeating that pattern rather than creating a new one. This is why habits feel so automatic. The brain has already wired a pathway that allows that reaction to happen with minimal effort. When you wake up each morning and immediately begin thinking the same familiar thoughts about responsibilities, worries, frustrations, expectations, you are essentially reactivating the same neural network that produced yesterday's personality. The body quickly follows. Those familiar thoughts trigger familiar emotions. Stress hormones may appear. Irritation might arise. Anxiety or impatience may quietly enter the nervous system. Before the day has even begun, the body has already stepped into the emotional signature of the past. Friends, this is how the habit of being yourself continues day after day. The mind remembers. The body reacts. The personality repeats. Pruning this habit begins with awareness of those patterns as they appear. During meditation, you observe the thoughts that normally define your identity. Perhaps the mind complains about something. Perhaps it judges a situation. Perhaps it begins replaying a memory or worrying about a future event. Instead of engaging with that thought, you simply notice it. That moment of noticing is like holding a pair of pruning shears in the garden of your mind. You recognize the branch. You see the pattern, and you choose not to feed it with attention. Friends, attention is energy. Whatever you repeatedly focus on becomes stronger inside the brain. When you stop feeding a particular thought pattern with attention and emotion, the neural pathway associated with it begins weakening. Neuroscience calls this process synaptic pruning. The brain literally removes connections that are no longer used frequently. Imagine what this means for personal transformation. Every time you observe a thought without reacting emotionally, the brain receives a subtle message that the circuit responsible for that thought is no longer necessary. Over time, that circuit begins losing its strength. Gradually, the thought appears less often. Gradually, the emotional reaction becomes weaker. Gradually, the identity connected to that pattern begins fading. Friends, something equally important is happening in the body during this process. The body has memorized emotional states through years of repetition. When you stop reacting to familiar thoughts, the body may feel uncomfortable because it is no longer receiving the chemical signals it expects. You may feel restless. You may feel impatient. You may feel a sudden urge to end the meditation session or distract yourself. The body is simply asking for the familiar emotions it has learned to depend on. This moment is one of the most powerful turning points in the transformation process. Because when you remain still and continue observing rather than reacting, you are teaching the body a new lesson. You are showing it that those emotional patterns are no longer necessary. Friends, in that quiet resistance, the body slowly begins freeing itself from the past. The emotional addiction weakens. The nervous system becomes more balanced. The brain learns that it does not need to return to those old patterns. Something remarkable begins unfolding within the mind during this stage. When old neural circuits weaken, new circuits have room to grow. Imagine your brain as a vast forest. For years, certain pathways have been walked repeatedly, creating clear trails through the landscape. When you stop walking those trails, nature slowly begins reclaiming them. Grass grows, branches fall across the path. Eventually, the trail disappears. Meanwhile, new paths begin forming in other directions. This is the beauty of neuroplasticity. The brain is not fixed. It is constantly reorganizing itself based on how you use it. Friends, every meditation session becomes an opportunity to reinforce the new pathways you want to build. After observing and releasing old thoughts, you gently direct your attention toward a new possibility. Perhaps you imagine yourself responding to life with patience instead of frustration. Perhaps you feel gratitude where worry once lived. Perhaps you picture yourself walking through the world with confidence and calm. These mental rehearsals create new neural connections. Emotion then strengthens those connections. When you feel elevated emotions, joy, appreciation, inspiration, compassion, the body begins producing chemistry that supports those states. The nervous system learns that these emotions can become the new normal. Friends, this process does not happen overnight. Just as a garden takes time to grow after pruning, the mind also requires patience. Some days the old thoughts will appear strongly. Some days the body will resist change. Those moments are not failures. They are part of the pruning process. Each time you notice the pattern and gently return to awareness, you are weakening the old identity. Each time you choose a new thought or emotion, you are strengthening the new one. Gradually, the personality you have practiced for years begins loosening its hold. The voice that once dominated your mind becomes quieter. The emotional reactions that once felt automatic become optional. A new sense of spaciousness appears within your awareness. Friends, within that space, something extraordinary becomes possible. Choice. You are no longer forced to repeat the same reactions that defined your past. You begin responding to life intentionally rather than automatically. This is the moment when transformation moves from theory into reality. Because once the old branches have been pruned away, the mind finally has room to grow in directions it never explored before. And in that quiet, expanding landscape of awareness, the person you are becoming slowly begins revealing themselves. Calmer, clearer, more creative, and more free than the version of yourself that once believed change was impossible. If you want a new future, you must stop emotionally rehearsing your past. Friends, that statement may sound simple, yet within it lives one of the most profound discoveries about human transformation. Most people believe that memories live only in the mind, stored quietly in the brain like files in a cabinet. Yet neuroscience reveals something far more fascinating. Memories do not live only in the brain. They live in the body. Every emotional experience you have ever had, moments of joy, disappointment, anger, fear, embarrassment, excitement, creates a chemical signal that travels through the nervous system and the bloodstream. The brain releases neurochemicals that instruct the body how to feel, and the body responds by producing physical sensations that match that emotion. Over time, friends, the body memorizes those feelings. The more frequently an emotion is repeated, the more familiar it becomes. Eventually, the body becomes so accustomed to those chemical signals that it begins anticipating them. The emotional state becomes part of your identity. This is why a person who has experienced years of stress may wake up already feeling tense. A person who has carried resentment for a long time may feel irritation even when nothing negative has happened yet. The body remembers the emotion and begins recreating it automatically. In a very real way, the body becomes the subconscious mind. And when the body memorizes the past emotionally, it keeps pulling the mind back into the same identity again and again. Friends, This is why true transformation requires more than simply thinking positive thoughts. The mind may try to imagine a new future, but if the body continues feeling the emotions of the past, the old identity remains active. Week 3 of this journey focuses on something incredibly powerful: dismantling the emotional memory of the old self. Imagine carrying a backpack filled with stones everywhere you go. Each stone represents an emotional experience from the past: anger from an old conflict, fear from a painful moment, disappointment from a failed attempt, sadness from a loss that still echoes inside your memory. Over time, the backpack becomes heavy, yet you may forget you are even carrying it. Those stones begin shaping how you walk through the world. They influence how you interpret events. They color how you respond to people. They silently guide the choices you make. Friends, dismantling the memory of the old self means slowly removing those stones from the backpack. Meditation becomes the space where this process unfolds. When you sit quietly and withdraw attention from the environment, something interesting begins happening. Without external distractions pulling your attention outward, the inner landscape of the mind becomes more visible. Thoughts appear, memories surface, emotions arise. Instead of reacting to them, you observe them. This moment of observation is incredibly important, because when you become aware of an emotion without immediately reacting, you interrupt the chemical cycle that normally reinforces that emotion. For years, the brain and body have worked together in a predictable pattern. A memory appears in the mind. The brain releases chemicals associated with that memory. The body feels the emotion, and then the body signals the brain to continue thinking thoughts that match that feeling. It becomes a loop. A thought produces a feeling. The feeling produces more thoughts. Friends, meditation allows you to step outside that loop. When an old emotion appears during meditation, you resist the urge to follow it. Instead, you breathe, remain still, and observe the sensation as if you are watching a wave rise and fall in the ocean. The wave may feel strong at first. It may even feel uncomfortable. Yet something fascinating happens when you continue observing without reacting. The wave begins losing its intensity. This is because emotions are chemical reactions within the body, and chemical reactions naturally fade if they are not continuously reinforced by thought. Each time you allow an emotion to rise and pass without feeding it with more thoughts, you weaken the memory attached to it. Friends, this is how the emotional history stored in the body slowly begins dissolving. Neuroscience suggests that memories are not fixed recordings of the past. Each time you recall a memory, the brain briefly reactivates the neural network associated with it. During that moment, the memory becomes flexible again before being stored once more. Meditation uses this natural process in a transformative way. When an old memory arises during meditation and you observe it calmly instead of reacting emotionally, the brain begins storing that memory in a new way. The emotional charge weakens. The identity connected to that memory becomes less dominant. Gradually, the memory loses its power to control your reactions. Friends, dismantling the memory of the old self is not about erasing your past. The past will always exist as part of your story. What changes is the emotional energy attached to those experiences. When the emotional charge disappears, the memory becomes simply information rather than a trigger. Something else begins happening during this stage of transformation. As the emotional weight of the past decreases, the mind becomes quieter and more spacious. Thoughts slow down. The nervous system relaxes. Awareness expands beyond the familiar personality you have carried for years. In that open space, imagination becomes incredibly powerful. The brain is no longer dominated by the emotional patterns of the past, which means it becomes more receptive to new possibilities. Friends, this is where mental rehearsal becomes a powerful tool. You begin imagining a new version of yourself, not the one defined by past memories, but the one defined by future potential. Perhaps you imagine yourself responding to challenges with calm confidence. Perhaps you see yourself speaking with clarity and courage. Perhaps you feel gratitude for opportunities that have not yet appeared. These images begin forming new neural circuits within the brain. And when you combine those images with elevated emotions, joy, appreciation, inspiration, the body begins learning a new emotional language. The chemistry of the future replaces the chemistry of the past. Slowly, friends, the body stops expecting the old emotions. The nervous system becomes balanced. The mind becomes more creative. The identity you once believed was permanent begins dissolving. Something beautiful begins emerging in its place. A sense of freedom. Freedom from the emotional echoes that once shaped your reactions. Freedom from the stories that once limited your imagination. Freedom from the identity that once felt impossible to change. Imagine walking through life without constantly carrying the emotional weight of the past. Imagine waking up each morning without the mind immediately replaying old memories. Imagine responding to situations with fresh awareness instead of automatic reactions. This is the state that begins forming when the memory of the old self loses its power. Friends, transformation does not require becoming someone completely different. It simply requires releasing the emotional patterns that no longer serve who you are becoming. The old identity fades not through force, but through awareness, through patience, through repeated moments of observation where you choose presence instead of reaction. And in the quiet space left behind after the past loosens its grip, something new gently begins unfolding. A mind that is lighter, a body that is calmer, and a future that finally feels open enough to be created rather than repeated. The future is not something you enter. It is something you create with the mind you choose to practice today. Friends, by now something important has already begun happening inside you. The emotional gravity of the past has started loosening its hold. The familiar reactions that once felt automatic are becoming visible, almost like old habits standing quietly in the corner of your awareness. That space you have created through observation and meditation is not empty. It is fertile. It is the ground where a completely new mind can grow. Transformation does not stop when we release the old self. Releasing is only the first half of the process. The second half is creation. Nature does not tolerate empty space for long. Once the old neural patterns weaken, the brain begins searching for new directions to grow. This is where the most exciting part of the journey begins. Creating a new mind means deliberately installing the mental and emotional patterns that belong to your future rather than the ones inherited from your past. For most of our lives, the brain has been shaped by external experiences. Every conversation, every environment, every challenge and disappointment has wired the nervous system to react in familiar ways. The personality becomes a reflection of the past. Thoughts trigger emotions, emotions reinforce behaviors, and behaviors strengthen identity. Yet neuroscience now reveals a remarkable truth about the human brain. The brain does not know the difference between a real experience and one that is vividly imagined with strong emotion. This discovery changes everything. When you mentally rehearse a new experience with focused attention, the brain begins forming neural circuits as if the event were actually happening. The neurons that fire together begin wiring together. Gradually, the brain starts preparing the body to behave in that new way. Friends, this is how a new mind is built. Instead of waiting for the external world to change first, you begin rehearsing the internal experience of the future you want to live. Picture an athlete preparing for a competition. Long before stepping onto the field, the athlete spends hours mentally practicing the movements of the body. Each movement is imagined in vivid detail. The muscles are not physically moving, yet the brain is activating the same neural pathways involved in the real action. By the time the athlete performs physically, the brain has already rehearsed success many times. You can use the same principle to shape your identity. During meditation, you enter a state where the mind becomes calm and the brain waves slow down. In that relaxed state, the barrier between the conscious mind and the subconscious becomes thinner. The subconscious mind, which normally runs the automatic habits of your personality, becomes more receptive to new instructions. This is where you begin designing your future self. Friends, imagine the person you want to become, not in vague terms, but in clear emotional detail. Ask yourself how that person thinks, how that person speaks, how that person responds when life presents challenges. Perhaps that future version of you wakes up feeling grateful instead of overwhelmed. Perhaps that person moves through the day with calm confidence rather than stress. Perhaps that person approaches opportunities with creativity and courage instead of hesitation. Once you see that version of yourself clearly in the mind, something powerful happens. Your brain begins reorganizing itself around that image. Neural circuits associated with those new thoughts begin forming. The more often you rehearse those thoughts, the stronger those circuits become. Gradually, the brain begins recognizing this new pattern as familiar. Friends, thought alone is powerful, but emotion is what makes the transformation real. Emotion is the language of the body. When you feel an elevated emotion, joy, love, gratitude, inspiration, the body releases chemistry that signals safety, expansion, and possibility. These emotions create coherence between the brain and the heart. The nervous system becomes balanced and the mind becomes more creative. When you combine a clear mental image of your future with the feeling of gratitude, as if that future has already arrived, you are teaching the body to experience the future in the present moment. The body begins believing the new reality before it physically appears. This is where the concept of energy and vibration becomes meaningful. Every emotional state carries a specific energetic signature. Stress and fear create chaotic signals within the nervous system, while gratitude and inspiration create coherent patterns. When your internal state becomes coherent, the brain and body operate with greater efficiency. Friends, the energy you broadcast through your thoughts and emotions begins influencing how you interact with the world. A mind that constantly rehearses worry will notice more problems. A mind that practices appreciation will notice more opportunities. Your internal state becomes a filter through which you experience reality. Creating a new mind, therefore, means choosing the thoughts and emotions that belong to the life you want to create. During meditation, you repeatedly rehearse that state. The mind imagines the future. The body feels the emotion. The brain wires the pattern. The nervous system memorizes the feeling. Gradually, something extraordinary begins unfolding. The new personality starts appearing naturally in daily life. You may notice that situations that once triggered stress no longer affect you in the same way. You may find yourself responding with patience where frustration once lived. New ideas may appear more easily. Opportunities may suddenly feel more visible. Friends, these changes are not coincidences. They are signs that your brain and body are beginning to operate from a new internal program. The future you imagine during meditation is slowly becoming the person you express throughout the day. Yet an important step remains: consistency. The brain strengthens whatever it practices most frequently. If you return to the emotional habits of the past every day, the old circuits will remain active. But if you repeatedly rehearse the new identity with intention and emotion, the new circuits will eventually become stronger than the old ones. At that point, the new personality becomes natural. The body wakes up expecting gratitude. The mind begins thinking creatively without effort. Confidence appears not because you force it, but because the brain has been trained to operate that way. Friends, this is how a new future is created, not by waiting for life to change first, but by becoming the person who naturally produces that life. A new mind leads to new choices. New choices create new experiences. New experiences reinforce the identity you have been rehearsing. Slowly, the distance between imagination and reality disappears. The person you once visualized during quiet moments of meditation begins walking through the world in your place, thinking new thoughts, feeling new emotions, responding to life with clarity and purpose. And somewhere within that quiet transformation, you realize something remarkable. The future was never waiting for you somewhere ahead in time. It was waiting within the mind you decided to create. True change is proven not in what you imagined during meditation, but in how you live when life begins testing the new version of you. Friends, by this point in our journey, something subtle yet powerful has been unfolding inside the mind and body. The old emotional patterns have been observed and gently released. The familiar thoughts that once replayed the past have begun losing their authority. A new internal landscape has been forming, shaped by intentional thoughts, elevated emotions, and the quiet discipline of awareness. Yet the real magic of transformation does not remain inside the meditation room. It begins revealing itself when you walk back into the world. The environment around you still looks the same. The people are the same. The responsibilities remain familiar. The circumstances that once triggered automatic reactions still appear exactly as they did before. But something within you has changed. This stage of the journey is about demonstrating the new self you have been rehearsing internally. It is about becoming transparent, allowing your thoughts, emotions, and actions to align so clearly that the new personality you have created within becomes visible in the way you live. Friends, the world has a fascinating way of testing transformation. Imagine spending weeks cultivating calm, gratitude, and patience during meditation. The brain has begun wiring those patterns. The body has memorized the feelings of elevated emotions. Your internal state has become more coherent and balanced. Then one morning, a familiar situation appears. Perhaps someone speaks to you in a way that once triggered frustration. Perhaps an unexpected challenge interrupts your plans. Perhaps the day brings a moment that would normally create stress or doubt. In that instant, the old personality quietly waits in the background. The old neural circuits are still there, though weaker now. The body still remembers the emotional reactions it practiced for years. The environment is presenting the same stimulus that once activated those patterns automatically. This is the moment of demonstration. Friends, true transformation is not about avoiding those moments. It is about responding to them differently. When you choose patience instead of irritation, the brain receives a powerful signal that the new circuit is now the preferred pathway. When you remain calm instead of reacting with stress, the nervous system strengthens the emotional memory of that calm state. Each time you respond differently than you used to, the new personality becomes more real. The environment is no longer controlling your internal state. Instead, your internal state begins influencing how you experience the environment. This is what it means to become transparent. Your thoughts match your actions. Your intentions match your behavior. The person you rehearsed during meditation is the same person that now walks through the world. Friends, the brain learns fastest through experience. When the body physically acts in alignment with the new mind you have created, the transformation becomes embodied. The nervous system stores the experience as a new reference point. Suddenly, the new identity feels less like an idea and more like who you truly are. Think of it as stepping into a new role that once existed only in imagination. At first, it may feel unfamiliar. The mind may occasionally question whether the new behavior is natural. Yet each time you demonstrate that behavior in real life, the brain strengthens its belief that this is the new normal. Over time, the unfamiliar becomes comfortable. Confidence begins appearing without effort. Calm responses replace automatic reactions. Gratitude begins surfacing naturally in moments where frustration once dominated. Friends, something even deeper begins unfolding during this stage. When your internal state becomes coherent, when your thoughts, emotions, and actions align, the brain and heart begin communicating in a synchronized rhythm. The nervous system enters a state of balance and clarity. In this state, the mind becomes more creative, intuition becomes sharper, opportunities become more visible. This happens because the brain is no longer spending energy defending old emotional patterns or replaying past experiences. That energy becomes available for awareness, creativity, and intentional living. Living your new reality, therefore, becomes an ongoing practice of alignment. Each day offers opportunities to embody the future you have been rehearsing. Every conversation, every challenge, every unexpected moment becomes a chance to demonstrate the new personality you have created. Friends, imagine walking into a room carrying the energy of calm confidence. Without saying a word, people around you sense something different. Your presence feels grounded. Your responses are thoughtful rather than reactive. Your behavior reflects the inner transformation that has taken place. This is the quiet power of becoming transparent. The internal work you have done begins influencing the external world around you. Over time, something fascinating occurs. The environment itself begins responding differently. People may treat you differently because your reactions have changed. Opportunities may appear because your perception has expanded. Challenges may feel easier because your emotional resilience has grown. Friends, life begins reflecting the new state of being you have practiced internally. Yet the most important transformation is not what happens around you. It is what happens within you. Imagine waking up in the morning without the heavy emotional patterns that once defined your mood. Imagine approaching the day with curiosity rather than worry. Imagine responding to life's unpredictability with clarity instead of stress. This is the experience of living from the new mind you have created. The old personality gradually fades into memory. The future you once visualized becomes the person who naturally thinks, feels, and acts through you. Friends, transformation reaches its fullest expression when the line between meditation and daily life disappears. The awareness you cultivated in stillness begins guiding you through every moment of the day. Your thoughts become more intentional. Your emotions become more balanced. Your actions reflect the conscious choices you have practiced repeatedly. In that state, something remarkable becomes clear. You are no longer waiting for the world to change in order to feel fulfilled. You are no longer defined by the memories of the past or the reactions that once felt automatic. Instead, you are living as the creator of your experience, one moment, one thought, one conscious choice at a time. And somewhere within that quiet realization, friends, the life you once imagined begins unfolding not as a distant possibility, but as the reality you now carry within you wherever you go. The greatest discovery of all time is that a person can change their future by merely changing their attitude. That simple idea has echoed through psychology, neuroscience, and spiritual philosophy for generations. Yet its real power only becomes clear when you begin to experience it within yourself. When the thoughts you once believed were permanent begin to loosen their grip. When emotions that once controlled you slowly transform into signals of awareness rather than chains of the past. I want you to pause for a moment here with me, friends, because what you have just journeyed through is not simply a collection of ideas about neuroscience, meditation, or self-development. It is something much deeper, something more personal. It is a map of human transformation. It is the realization that the brain you were born with is not fixed, that the personality you carried for years is not permanent, and that the life you have been experiencing is not a final destination, but a reflection of patterns that can change. Earlier in our journey, we explored how the brain constantly rewires itself through a process known as neuroplasticity, and how repeated thoughts strengthen neural circuits until those circuits become automatic behaviors, until they become habits of thinking, habits of feeling, habits of reacting. Over time, those habits begin shaping your identity. Eventually, the body memorizes emotions so deeply that it starts living in the past, even when the present moment is offering something completely new. This realization can feel confronting at first. It means that many of the struggles we carry are not simply caused by the outside world. but by internal programs running beneath our awareness. Stress responses triggered by old experiences, emotional conditioning stored in the body, belief systems shaped by repetition. These mechanisms quietly influence our choices every single day. Yet here is the extraordinary truth hidden within that awareness. If the brain can learn those patterns, it can also unlearn them. If the mind can memorize limitation, it can also memorize freedom. And if the body can become conditioned by survival emotions, it can also be elevated by creative emotions like gratitude, inspiration, love, and possibility. This is where transformation begins. Not in the outside world, not in circumstances suddenly rearranging themselves, but within the invisible space between thought and emotion, within the quiet moment where awareness wakes up and realizes that the observer inside you is far more powerful than the programs running through you. Meditation became our doorway into that space. When you sit in stillness and close your eyes, something remarkable begins to happen. Your attention slowly moves away from the familiar environment, away from the predictable routines, away from the endless reminders of who you used to be. The brain begins shifting from the constant stimulation of the outer world into a deeper internal awareness. Brain waves slow down, the analytical mind softens, and suddenly the subconscious becomes accessible. This is the moment where mental rehearsal becomes possible. Inside that quiet inner world, you begin imagining a different version of yourself. You begin visualizing new behaviors, new choices, new emotional states. And something fascinating occurs in the brain. Neural networks start forming even though the experience is happening only in imagination. To the brain, vividly imagined practice can feel almost identical to real experience. Friends, this is not fantasy. This is how the brain learns. Athletes rehearse movements before competitions. Musicians mentally practice entire performances before touching their instruments. Entrepreneurs envision solutions before launching ideas into the world. The brain begins preparing for a future that has not yet physically happened. Now imagine applying that same process to your identity. Imagine rehearsing patience instead of frustration. Imagine feeling gratitude before success appears. Imagine embodying confidence before the world validates it. Gradually, the emotional chemistry in the body begins to shift. The old stress responses lose their dominance. Elevated emotions begin creating a new internal environment. Hormones change, neural pathways strengthen, and the body starts becoming familiar with a future personality rather than a past personality. Transformation is no longer an abstract concept. It becomes biology. Many people spend years waiting for life to change before they allow themselves to feel differently. They wait for the job promotion before feeling confident, for the relationship before feeling loved, for the financial breakthrough before feeling abundant. But the deeper truth revealed by neuroscience and consciousness research is beautifully paradoxical. The emotional state often comes first. When you practice elevated emotions in advance, when gratitude and inspiration become familiar states instead of rare reactions, your brain and body start aligning with new possibilities. The mind begins noticing opportunities that were invisible before. Decisions become clearer. Creativity awakens. You are no longer reacting to life. You are participating in its creation. This is the shift from survival to creation. In survival mode, the brain constantly scans for threats. The body lives in adrenaline and cortisol. Attention becomes narrow, reactive, defensive. Creativity struggles to emerge because the nervous system is focused on protection. Creation mode feels entirely different. Attention expands. Curiosity returns. Imagination becomes active again. Energy once consumed by stress becomes available for growth. Many people describe this transition as stepping into a new reality, yet the external world often changes slowly. The real transformation happens internally first. Thoughts become intentional rather than automatic. Emotions become chosen rather than conditioned. Identity begins evolving. Over time, the world starts reflecting those inner shifts in subtle ways. Relationships improve because reactions change. Opportunities appear because perception expands. Challenges become teachers instead of enemies. Life starts feeling less like a battle and more like a creative process. Friends, this journey never required perfection. Transformation is not about eliminating every negative thought or never experiencing difficult emotions again. Human experience will always contain contrast, uncertainty, and moments of struggle. The difference lies in awareness. When awareness grows, you recognize patterns sooner. When awareness deepens, you interrupt automatic reactions faster. When awareness strengthens, you choose responses aligned with who you want to become rather than who you used to be. Each conscious choice rewires the brain. Each elevated emotion reconditions the body. Each moment of presence breaks another link in the chain of the past. Little by little, the old identity dissolves, not through force, but through replacement. A new personality begins emerging, one thought, one emotion, one decision at a time. Friends, imagine what becomes possible when millions of individuals begin practicing this level of self-awareness. Imagine classrooms where students understand their own thought patterns, workplaces where creativity replaces chronic stress, communities where emotional intelligence becomes a shared language. Transformation at the personal level eventually becomes transformation at the collective level. Every shift inside you contributes to that larger evolution. The journey you have experienced through this audiobook is only the beginning. Knowledge becomes powerful only when it transforms into practice, when ideas become daily habits, when awareness becomes a lifestyle rather than a momentary inspiration. Meditation becomes the laboratory. Self-observation becomes the compass. Intentional emotion becomes the fuel for the future you are creating. Friends, if this journey resonated with you, if these ideas sparked curiosity, reflection, or even a small moment of insight, take a moment right now to support the path of learning and growth. If you enjoyed this audiobook experience, make sure to like this video so more seekers can discover it. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that change is possible. And subscribe to CliffNote Chronicles so you never miss upcoming audiobooks exploring powerful ideas from psychology, philosophy, neuroscience, and personal transformation. Because every new insight you encounter has the potential to shift your perspective, and every shift in perspective opens the door to a different future. The story of who you are becoming is still unfolding. Your brain is still rewiring. Your mind is still learning. Your future is still being written. And the most powerful author of that story has always been quietly listening inside you.